Here's what's happening. Well, planet Earth dodged a bullet, sort of. A wave of charged plasma particles from a huge solar eruption, an X-flare, has glanced off the Earth's northern pole, lighting up auroras and disrupting some radio communications. But the Earth appears to have escaped a widespread geomagnetic storm, which affects confined to the northern latitudes, possibly reaching down into Norway and parts of Canada. And several small earthquakes, ranging in magnitude from 1.8 to 3.8, have rattled the north-central Arkansas cities of Greenbrier and Guy this week, and the cause is unknown. The U.S. Geological Survey has reported more than 30 earthquakes in the area since Sunday, including a magnitude 3.8 quake on Thursday morning, and at least 16 others occurring Wednesday, two of which were magnitudes 3.2 and 3.5. Scott Osbrooks, a geohazard supervisor for the Arkansas Geological Survey, said the quakes are part of what is now called the Guy earthquake swarm, a series of mild earthquakes that have been occurring periodically since 2009. EarthChangesMedia.com's Mitch Batris with us. Mitch, first the X-flare. We lucked out again, didn't we?
Well, yes. Just to keep things in perspective, cycle 23, the previous cycle before this one, we've had much larger X-class flares. But here's what's going on, George. This was it was an X-class flare. It was large. It was Earth-directed, and we're experiencing the consequences of that right now as we speak. It takes about between 48 and 72 hours to get the bulk of the charged particles, the plasma, as you mentioned earlier in the news release. The initial hit takes only maybe 8 minutes, but that's kind of the blast going the speed of light. Then the big particles come after. Now, what makes this X-class flare, which is a smaller X-class flare, more dangerous, and that goes for any X-class flare that's coming from this point on, is that the magnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field, has weakened. Now, that's all part of the pole shift that we're in right now. This magnetic pole shift, it's in fluctuation. It's not something that happens in 1 day or 1 hour. However, it takes much less time than what was previously thought. A magnetic flip now is believed to take less than a decade. Now, that's already started. I mean, that's been going on for several months. Some believe that's been happening for maybe 3 to 4 years already. As it gets closer to that pivotal point, it does become rapid. So in the last time of a magnetic flip, it really does occur within maybe a 72-hour period. So it's very interesting times, but even these smaller flares, X-class is not a small flare, relatively smaller than the ones we had in cycle 23.
But anything could happen.
But anything could happen. Now, related to the earthquake, there is data, scientific data, that does suggest there is a definite connection between solar activity and earthquakes, and volcanic activity for that matter. One of the reasons for that is the Earth's core. The Earth's core, the magma and the tectonic plates, is all related. I mean, that's what makes a dipole. You have to have two ends to make a dipole. So we have the charged particles coming from the sun, and then the magnetic bar, if you will, in the middle of Earth, part of the Earth's core, that creates this magnetic flux that happens on the North Pole and South Pole. Well, that in itself lends the possibilities to earthquakes occurring. I'm not saying that's directly responsible to Arkansas, but I will say that we're getting double messages from Arkansas right now.
And this is the New Madrid Fault, right?
This is the New Madrid Fault. The New Madrid Fault, for many of your listeners, extends from about what they're calling Illinois, Cairo, Illinois in particular, south through northeast Arkansas, west over to Kentucky and Tennessee, and then goes westward to include lower areas of southern Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, or the Oklahoma-Texas border up there. That is the New Madrid Fault. So this is within that period. Now, some of the seismologists there are suggesting that this has to do with some kind of gas release. There is gas drilling going on. I can't say that that's not happening. But what they do leave out is that could one affect the other. So whether it be the solar storm or if, in fact, it could be related to a gas well. I can't say for sure, but could that event set off turbulence and quakes? The answer is yes.
That is a good question and a good answer. More than 700 quakes have occurred in the region over the past 6 months. Mitch Batris with us, earthchangesmedia.com. Linked up on our Twitter feed. Bahrain's leaders banned public gatherings and sent tanks into the streets Thursday, intensifying a crackdown that killed 5 anti-government protesters, wounded more than 200, and turned a hospital into a cauldron of anguish and rage against the monarchy there. More problems in the Middle East, too. The streets in Bahrain were mostly empty after the bloody clampdown. Thousands defied authorities by marching in cities as well in Libya, Yemen, and also Iraq, as a wave of political unrest continues in the wake of uprisings that toppled leaders in Egypt and Tunisia. Crime rates in the United States have dropped significantly in the last 2 decades and continue to be in a steady downward trajectory, according to the FBI. But here are some of the cities that the incidents of crime are up over the national rate. Number 1, St. Louis, Atlanta, Birmingham, Alabama, Orlando, Detroit, Memphis, Miami, and Baltimore. Many travelers who fall ill within a day or two of a recent flight blame the quality of the cabin air. But apparently, as it turns out, airplane air is no worse than what you'd encounter in your average office building. It's that coughing and sneezing seatmate that you need to worry about, they say. Airplane air isn't as bad as most people envision, says a environmental microbiologist. He's known as Dr. Germ. He studies germs and where they congregate. And he says you really should worry more about the food you eat and the things you touch. That's what'll make you sick. Taking zinc syrup, tablets, lozenges can lessen the severity and duration of the common cold, according to experts. A review of the available scientific evidence suggests that taking zinc within a day of the onset of a cold symptom speeds recovery, and it may also help ward off the colds, but they say zinc cannot be used long-term because of its toxicity, and they're concerned about that. Now, over the years, George Eby has become the world's leading authority on the only effective common cold treatment, zinc lozenges, and the release of ionic zinc. He pioneered the subject with his breakthrough 1984 common cold treatment research. He doesn't sell any products. Here's George right now. George, you knew this all along. Now science is beginning to catch up with you.
Well, 26 years later, yeah, finally.
So if people are coming down with a cold, what do you suggest they do?
Do not use a zinc lozenge. It may sound strange, but I haven't found any of the zinc lozenges on the commercial market that release enough ionic zinc to do any good. They do not release the active form. In other words, regular zinc it doesn't taste bad. It tastes like candy. A zinc lozenge that tastes like candy is not going to work because it does not contain the ionic zinc, and it's the ionic zinc and only the ionic zinc that has any effect on colds. And zinc acetate's about the only thing that really can release an adequate amount of ionic zinc. And it's unfortunate that people have added things like citric acid and tartaric acid and like glycine and all sorts of other things to flavor mask the zinc lozenges to make them taste like candy. Well, guess what? Candy won't cure a cold. It just won't.
Not at all. So where do you find this kind of zinc?
I think I'm the only one that manufactures zinc acetate throat lozenges, and I quit selling them in December of 2010. I've been fighting this battle for 30 years, and I just kind of got tired of the naysayers, and they just kind of wore me down. It's kind of sad. What we need to do is have scientists and people who are really interested in this technology go to my website and read the medical journal articles that are there that explain how to make properly made zinc lozenges that will shorten the common cold by 7 days. This is not hard.
No.
My website? It's real simple. coldcure.com. What else?
You got it. Thanks, George. George Eby. That's what he's talking about. They're saying zinc works to fight the common cold. Police say a teenage burglar told them he poisoned and killed 3 goldfish as he didn't want to leave any witnesses. The 16-year-old boy was one of 3 teens facing burglary charges after a break-in at a home in Arlington Heights, Chicago. Police Sergeant Mike Hernandez says it's a little disturbing. According to the police report, he looked at the fish tank and said, We can't leave any witnesses. Jeez. And doctors in China examined a patient complaining of headaches and a bad taste in his mouth. They found a 4-inch blade buried in his face. It had been there for 4 years. He had been stabbed in a robbery working as a cab driver. He did not know he had it in him. How can that be? We've got the story in the news at coasttocoastam.com. And the Department of Homeland Security, in an effort to clamp down on websites that host and advertise child pornography, inadvertently shut down more than 84,000 innocent websites across the internet. The DHS announced the seizure of 10 domain names of websites that were believed to host or advertise child porn, but one of those domains was actually a DNS server that managed hosting up to 84,000 separate and independent websites. Now, what does this all mean? Well, in a moment, we're going to talk with our expert, Lauren Weinstein, in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Lauren Weinstein has been involved with the development of the Internet for decades. Lauren is an expert regarding a wide range of privacy issues. Lauren, I can't believe this. 84,000 websites accidentally shut down?
Yeah, that's probably the start of what's going to be a long, sad saga the way things are going. It wasn't just shut down. It's actually better than that. The sites actually got diverted to a DHS ICE webpage that suggested they were involved in the distribution of child pornography. So you can imagine how businesses felt about their customers running into a page like that when they came to visit. And this has been rectified now, but there was really no apology, which seems appropriate because there was no due process involved in the first place. So why would you expect an apology, right?
The dangerous part of all this, Lauren, is the ability to do this and shut these down.
Yeah, well, this is a fundamental problem in the domain name system. It's a central point of control and failure, and we're seeing more and more instances now where the U.S. Government, by virtue of the fact that a lot of this infrastructure is based here, and the companies that control this, the top-level domains are based here, they're just turning things off. And as you can imagine, the rest of the world isn't really very pleased about that. And there's those of us who feel that the domain name system actually needs to be completely replaced, but obviously that's a very long-term problem. The real irony here is that at the same time this is going on, and the Senate, just in the last couple of days, has been having hearings on what's called the Combating Online Infringement and Counterfeits Act, COICA, which would greatly extend the government's power to shut down websites. It started out as something to combat counterfeit pharmaceuticals, counterfeit drugs, but then it started having mission creep, and now it's turned into an intellectual property protection system, so that if a music label or a movie studio is concerned, it would give them a way to turn off sites very quickly. And at the same time, the FBI was testifying today that they want the ability to have access to the encryption keys for virtually all encrypted communications, Skype, peer-to-peer, everything. So it's all happening at the same time. That and along with this, we have had, for example, Secretary of State Clinton, just again, within the last few days, giving a speech about Internet freedoms, how the rest of the world needs to have Internet freedoms, complaining about how Egypt turned off their Internet. We all know that story very recently with all the events in Egypt. But the government here wants basically the same ability to turn off the U.S. Internet.
Isn't that strange? You're talking out of both ends of their mouths.
A little bit of hypocrisy there, perhaps.
Lauren, how close is this possibility of truly having the kill switch?
To disrupt the Internet here would be much more complicated than doing it in Egypt, just because you have more providers and more routes, more connectivity. But if you think about it, the concentration of ISPs in this country is such that most people, the vast majority of people, are customers of just a handful of very large ISPs. Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, Time Warner, so on. If you go to them and say, hey, national security, turn off, you would be able to do a lot of disruption, probably with relatively few phone calls in an hour.
A lot of us use the Internet almost all the time. Explain to us how this works. Kind of take us to, I'm beginning to envision, is there like a central building someplace in this country where everything goes through, and if you clip that, everything shuts down? How does this all work?
Well, the Internet, by definition, is a network of networks. That's how it's defined. And by and large, these networks are talking to each other independently. But the thing is, you have to have those junctions where they interconnect. And those are places of vulnerability. Those places where one network connects to another network.
And how many places are there?
There's quite a few of them.
Okay.
And they operate with something called the Border Gateway Protocol, which is used to route messages. In fact, that's how Egypt turned off their Internet. They basically deleted the routing table entries.
But there is not a single building where everything goes through?
Not that I know of. And given the technology of the Internet, I don't believe that exists. But effectively, the DNS, the domain name system we were talking about that just a minute ago, is so concentrated. If you just went to basically VeriSign, and VeriSign controls the registry for .com. That's a big one. They're going to control many, many more. There's probably going to be a vast explosion of top-level domains now, primarily to enrich the domain owners.
Well, it's going to also go now to .co, right?
Yeah, there already is a .co. Within the next couple of months, ICANN, which is in charge of how top-level domains, at least the generic ones, are distributed, is set to approve a whole new system with potentially hundreds, maybe thousands of these. I'm very much opposed to this. I think it's basically just a money-making scheme for what I call the domain industrial complex
right
now. And I think it's primarily going to cause confusion for consumers. A lot of people don't want it to happen. You're going to have litigation up the kazoo from either people that say this domain makes it easier to do censorship, or I didn't get control of this domain, I want all the money from that domain. It's going to be, the lawyers are going to do well.
Now, a company like GoDaddy.com,
yeah,
how do they interact with all of this? What do they do?
GoDaddy's a registrar.
So you go on there with a name, they check it, they put it up there on their site right away, whether it's available or not. If it's available, you pay for it, right?
Yeah, and they pay a portion of what you pay, at least in theory, to the registry that actually holds the data that's involved in that name.
And they're just the go-between?
Well, they're the point of contact for the consumer. They're the ones you would pay the money to. You don't normally pay the money directly to the registry.
Right.
That's a simplification, but it's close enough for jazz. So you have a lot of people, in the food chain of this who want to make money on this. And every time there's a new top-level domain that's issued, what you have is everybody that wants to protect their name feeling obligated to register their domain name in all of these new ones, because they don't. Does Disney want there to be a Disney.gay? I don't know. But there's a lot of talk now that there's going to be a .gay domain, a .xxx domain. There's a lot of controversy about .xxx from all sides, as you can imagine.
Huh.
All these different ones, and everyone who has a trademark, sort of feels like they're being held to the wall by an Al Capone operative. It's like an old protection racket, right? Hey, if you don't pay us, someone else is going to take your name.
You need some protection here.
Yeah, same thing. So we have it's really a perfect storm that's occurring now, and we're seeing these symptoms. We're seeing like ICE taking the 84,000 down and then saying, "Oops, sorry about that." But really, seriously, I mean, that I'm not an alarmist.
No, I know.
I try to be level-headed about these things. I try to take it from a technical standpoint, but I have never been so concerned about anything going on than this COICA legislation. Because what it's trying to do is it's trying to criminalize not only content on the Internet, and remember, we're talking about it.
And then who decides what is criminal and what isn't?
Well, the thing about this legislation is it basically eliminates most due process. Basically, it's just like getting a quick court order. Very simple. It's not like there's a trial or anything first to determine. It's obvious. That's how they managed to take down 84,000 just with a snap of a finger.
Who would make this decision?
You would have prosecutors, going to a judge. You would have, those kinds of entities going to a judge and say, we declare. The FBI is very much involved now and the Department of Justice is being very involved in intellectual property protection. So we've sort of conflated issues of security and safety with protecting movies and music.
Hold on for a second, Lauren. I want to talk more with you about this, and we'll open up the phone lines as well. Lauren Weinstein, our special guest, as we talk about shutting down the internet on Coast to Coast AM. So you're concerned, though, Lauren. You really are. You're not one who is an alarmist, as you said, but you're concerned about this.
Yeah, and what's particularly worrisome is that this new set, this whole array of attacks on internet freedoms are bipartisan. These things are coming out of committee, in some cases unanimously. All the Democrats, all the Republicans. It's a very, very nightmarish kind of scenario for those of us who have built up the internet over many, many years to see this happening. And I'll give you another example of what's occurring here that could change the internet in ways that most people couldn't even imagine. Part of the legislation that's being pushed now, and this is in the last few days even, is to essentially criminalize not only certain kinds of material on the internet, but linking to that material. There's a big push now to say that if Google, for example, has a link to something that has been declared to be illicit, rightly or wrongly, that Google could be held responsible for that,
Wow.
and that they would have to censor their own links to prevent people from finding the material that has been declared to be illicit or otherwise undesirable. Now imagine what this means in an international context. We're talking about U.S. laws here, but the internet is international. So that kind of situation is terrible. What this basically does is this has to do with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, which Congress passed years ago. It established what was called the safe harbor, which said that if material was put on the net, and if a website was notified that the material was infringing in some way, for example, on valid copyrights, the site had to remove it. But what's happened now is a lot of the intellectual property holders, and unfortunately much of this is Hollywood and the music industry, which has really gotten control over the process, they're saying that's not good enough. They want to be able to preemptively stop these things from being posted. Now imagine what that would mean for something, again, not just Google search listings, but imagine what that would mean for something like YouTube.
Oh, it would wipe them out.
Completely decimated. And this is not theoretical. This is not hypothetical. These are concepts now that are being pushed in a bipartisan manner by Congress right now into law, and there's virtually no one in Congress standing up to say, hey, maybe internet freedoms are more important.
Why not? Why not?
I think because there's not viewed as being a lot of political cost to doing this. And remember, you go to where the lobbying dollars are coming from, right?
Yeah.
But the hypocrisy of this going on at the same time that we're being critical of China and Egypt and making speeches about internet freedoms, it's like something out of a Kafka novel. It's just a complete mind bender, but this is all real. It's all happening. And for technologists like me, it's a nightmare coming true.
Let's go to the phones. Let's go to Skype, Auburn, Alabama. Julio's with us. Hi, Julio.
Hey, how you guys doing this evening?
Good,
Hi.
good.
Oh, thanks. I just got off a 17-hour bus ride from Macomb, Illinois, so this is the first thing I'm doing, listening to you guys. I got a question. I'm a broadcasting major, and I've been doing a lot of studying on the FCC, and I know that they have no legal authority to control the internet, cable, or satellite for that matter. So what can we, the people, do to, wake up others about the FCC and their power by decree, basically? They're just breaking all the rules here. How can we educate people on what the FCC can and can't do?
You're barking up the wrong tree, to be honest with you. I mean, it can be argued from a legal standpoint, the statutory authority of the FCC, but the FCC is small potatoes in all of this. You're kind of referring to the net neutrality battles. I'm in favor of net neutrality because it has nothing to do with censorship. It has to do with making sure that ISPs treat everybody fairly. But if you want to talk censorship, if you want to talk nightmares, look at this other legislation. Look at what Congress is doing. Don't worry about the FCC. That just vanishes into the distance in terms of importance when you look at Congress looking to fundamentally change internet freedoms in a way that would give all the power to very powerful moneyed interests and take them away from all the consumers. That is where people should be focusing their attention right now.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Let's go to Bill in Toronto, Canada. Hey, Bill, welcome to the program.
Oh, good morning, gentlemen.
Hi, Bill.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a few questions. Two of them are really quick, and the third one is more of a comment on what I am noticing here in Canada with censorship. So my first question is, when your DNS provider blocks a site, so you say you do abc.com and nothing comes up, or it says it's forbidden or something because they've put in a block, can you still get to that site with using the IP address if you knew it?
Yeah. All else being equal, the answer is yes. And in fact, that's why some of us are looking at alternatives, not just to get around that, but whole different ways of structuring the way you reach sites. The DNS can be bypassed.
Okay, so here's my second question, which is really quick, and then I have the comment I want to make. Do you know of a program that's already available, and if it isn't, maybe somebody could write one, or maybe one of the other listeners could call in and let us all know. Is there a program that could take all of your URL, LNK files that you have stored of all of your websites and convert, like read into it, or go on the internet and go to each site, get the real IP address, and add it to the name at the end of the link? If not, it would be a great program to write. I don't know how to program, but
such things exist, but they're of limited utility generally because IP addresses are not necessarily static in that way. They can change from depending on where you are. They can change day to day as servers come online and offline. So it's actually much more complicated than that. But the principle is sound, at least theoretically.
Okay. So my one quick comment is that Australia has already implemented internet censorship a couple of years ago. And what I'm noticing here in Canada, for example, I use a proxy server so that I can mask my IP and avoid a lot of problems with things that can happen when people get your IP address. So I go to a cafe that provides free Wi-Fi, and they use a company's services called OpenDNS, which you've probably heard of. Now, what they do is they have a category called proxy servers and anonymity identification, and any site that they have on their list, which is almost all of them, they block. So that means you can't have internet privacy when you are in one of these cafes because they've blocked all access to those things.
Yeah, well,
I'd like your comment on that.
Anytime there's public access points have become a major concern to those who want to restrict internet access, and one of the ways that will probably be approached in the future is another legislative thrust that's occurring right now here in the U.S., which is a trusted identity system that is being promoted. This is another federal initiative as a way to enhance online purchases and such by tying your internet identities to your government-issued identities, like your Social Security number here in the U.S., for example. But there are those of us that feel very strongly that kind of system would rapidly suffer mission creep.
Oh, yeah, that's dangerous.
And end up being pretty much a requirement to use a vast array of sites. So if you're forced to identify yourself to access the internet, ultimately, it's not going to matter where you're doing it from. They're going to know who you are anyway.
Let's go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. First-time caller. Scott, you're on.
Mr. Norre.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good, Scott. Thanks.
Yeah. My question is, a few days before they reinstated the Patriot Act, or extended it, at my library, the internet service went down for the whole county. There's about a dozen libraries. And I was wondering if they're possibly doing collecting data on certain things that you check out.
No, they're more likely running Microsoft software, and it does things like that all the time on its own. Seriously, those kinds of failures are almost always just technical failures of the systems. Anything at higher levels is not going to be so obvious.
Nothing sinister there, huh?
Yeah, very unlikely.
All right, let's go to Idaho Falls. Bill, your turn on Coast to Coast. Go ahead, Bill.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi there.
I'm sorry I didn't get on the beginning of this. I didn't catch the name of your guest.
Lauren Weinstein.
Oh, well, glad to Glad to make your acquaintance, sir. I wanted to ask you, preface, I was involved pretty early on in the Internet and also representing my site. And, we got a Class B address by calling somebody at USC. It was that long ago.
Wow.
But anyway, I wanted to ask why the vision I had for DNS evolving was that it would be a deeper structure. For instance, for airlines, you would have something like delta.air.com and united.air.com or something similar.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would have an authority for air, an authority for, it would be spread, and it would be deeper because the search times would be more optimum. And I was wondering why it didn't evolve that way. And a second question that you might be interested in answering. A long time ago, there was a standard called International Standards Organization Open Systems Interconnect, ISO OSI.
Mm-hmm.
And I experimented with that for a while at the behest of my employer, and it was a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but why didn't ISO OSI? That was the official line for a long time, and X400 mail was the official line for a long time in government departments. Why was ISO OSI largely a failure except for the directory standards?
Yeah, okay, I can answer both of those pretty quickly. In terms of DNS addresses, you're correct. It was envisioned at one point that it would be more of a hierarchical structure. Basically, the commercial forces of domain names altered that. That's my opinion. .com addresses became so valuable in and of themselves, and now domain addresses generally, that people wanted to have that top-level domain address, and it made the addresses that were deeper in less valuable because they were seen as second-class or third-class addresses. I think that's the short answer to that. The OSI model is actually kind of interesting, X400 and all of that, and I basically say that died the death of committee. At one time, the federal government here was actually mandating, that the existing system, the TCP/IP system that we use now, was going to be replaced by OSI type systems, at least by the federal government. It just never happened. The reason was that they were arguing continuously about the standards for OSI, and TCP/IP just worked. And the fact that it worked allowed more and more people to use it. And as the ARPANET, became the internet, and as the internet commercialized, TCP/IP became so embedded in the infrastructure that it just was success through technology, whereas OSI was failure through committee.
Lord, we are so dependent on the internet now and wireless communications. Everybody out there is Twittering, Facebook, social networking. What happens when it goes down?
Well, I think we saw an example of that in Egypt. I think that's something that has long been theorized, and we saw the practical effect of an entire country being cut off the internet, and apparently internet resources disrupted within the country also to a very large extent. And it's very, very dramatic. The financial losses to Egypt from that are enormous. I've seen all kinds of different numbers, but we're talking many tens of millions of dollars at least, and probably much more ultimately. And people had to resort. They were resorting to other mechanisms. They were using cell phones and such until the cell phone networks were cut off also. So we're kind of the victim of our own success to an extent here, because we've created these tremendous, marvelous communication infrastructures that do have ways of being disrupted.
It will happen one day. Whether it's done by government or done technically and there's some kind of mishap, it will happen.
I've had people say to me that the government would never do that here because it would be so disruptive economically. I actually think that that's a false assumption. I think that if the government feels that it's threatened for whatever reason, I think attempting to control communications will come first, and economic considerations will come second. I might be wrong about that. I actually hope I'm wrong about that. But human nature being what it is, I think that's a probable outcome if we ever end up in that place.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Let's go to Diane in Spencer, Wisconsin, east of the Rockies. Had some problems in Wisconsin today. Hi, Diane, go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for your show and for all the people that you have on.
You are welcome.
Excellent show. I still love listening to you. Okay, my question is now, since you're talking about the government and how they can come in and they can turn the computer off or they can look into your information. Well, I have nothing that's illegal as far as any of the stuff that you can get in trouble for, but I'm very much into police information. Because I have taken the class, and I really enjoy that kind of stuff as far as
crime. So you like to look at that.
Yeah. And I did work with a missing person group at one time, and always interested in what's going on as far as that, and also UFO information. I'm very much into that. I happen to have I like to collect the information, because if you're going along and you want to remember a certain website, you turn around and about a year or two later, you forget about it.
So you're concerned that they may say, all right, Diane, what are you doing with all these
Right.
things?
Can you get in trouble?
Well, the short answer is that would depend on what kind of information you have.
No.
If everything you have is public, public information, public domain information, then you're not likely to get into trouble in the current environment.
I mean, have you broken a law, Lauren, if you collect information on serial killers because you're fascinated with their minds?
Right. No. But the way things are these days, if you ever found yourself in trouble, you might find some smart prosecutor, after doing forensic analysis of your computer, saying, "Look at this person. Look at this stuff." An obvious mental issue here. So this happens all the time now when there are crimes. They go in forensically, and if they see a history of looking at certain sorts of information, that doesn't necessarily mean that person is a criminal, but that kind of information may be presented to a court, may affect prosecutions, and can have a negative effect.
Good point. Let's take one more call. Steve in Niagara Falls, Canada. Let's squeeze you in here, Stephen. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Great
Thank
to
you.
be on the show.
Hi.
I'd just like to start out by saying I think that the Internet as we know it today won't even look like it looks today in about 10 years' time. I think it's changing rapidly. And you had mentioned that the government in Egypt managed to shut down the Internet through erasing the routing tables.
Basically, yeah.
And I was just kind of curious how that would be possible, considering if they're using Border Gateway Protocol, most of the routing tables are dynamically learned, and they're just going to repopulate again.
Oh, you can kill them. you can definitely kill them. You can pull them out. You can make sure they don't come back. For Egypt, it was very, very straightforward. It would be tougher for the U.S. Just because of scale. I suspect if I was going to do it, I would do it a different way here. And if I can figure out a way to do it, there's other people who not only could figure out a way to do it, there's probably plans somewhere to try to take control in some way if a national security matter was declared. And again, there's legislation pending that's put under that cybersecurity banner that is specifically designed to give federal authority presidential control to declare that under certain conditions, certain parts of the Internet, or possibly the entire Internet, this is something that's argued, could be shut down in some way, whether it's done through Border Gateway Protocol, whether it's done by calling the ISPs and saying, pull your plugs. One way or another, if the government wants to do it, given the concentration of resources we have, the way that so few ISPs are the ISPs for so many people, it wouldn't be at all impossible to cause major disruptions on the Internet very quickly if the government chose to do so.
Lauren, you are a wealth of information, my friend. You're like a walking Internet all by yourself. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Lauren Weinstein, our special guest this hour. Up next, Earth Grids, the secret patterns of Gaia's sacred sites. Fascinating. Stand by. And tonight with our special guest, Hugh Newman, we're going to talk about Earth mysteries. Get ready. That includes ancient sites, crop circles, grids, ley lines, the origins of the Mayan calendar, everything you've wondered about. We're going to talk about in a moment right here on Coast to Coast AM. And get on over to the coasttocoastam.com website. Take a look at the photo that Hugh has sent us, the megalithic in Brittany. It's unbelievable, huge. Anyways, let me tell you a little bit about Hugh Newman. Earth mysteries expert, science researcher. He organizes conferences, co-edits the Avalon Rising magazine, hosts the Avalon Rising radio show and Glastonbury Radio. And here he is on Coast to Coast, author of Earth Grids. Hey, Hugh, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Good. Looking forward to this indeed. How did you get interested in these Earth mysteries?
Well, it's really the crop circles that kind of drew me in, because obviously in Britain we have them all over the country, especially in Wiltshire area. And so I started sort of investigating them just because they're like one of the most, or possibly the most incredible modern mystery. And as soon as you start exploring the landscape with those, you come across that you realise all of them are right next to ancient sites. And that kind of drew me in, just accidentally really, into this about 15 years ago. And then within a few months, I'd become a sort of hardcore megalithomaniac, and I was out there studying the sites as well and seeing all the connections, especially how the crop circles relate to the ancient sites with earth energies, with geometrical principles across the landscape, and all the sort of strange phenomena, all the lights that appear, the orbs that appear all in these areas. So yeah, that's what kind of drew me in originally.
You know, people are so obsessed with ancient sites. I mean, there's many. There's in the St. Louis area in Missouri, Hugh. There's Cahokia Downs in Illinois. They seem to be all over this planet, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, yeah, the more and more I explore, because I do a lot of traveling, just sort of research basically, you realize almost every country has megalithic sites going back to like between 3,000 and 5,000 years, literally all over the planet. And North America is possibly one of the most interesting places for that. You have the mound culture, like you mentioned, going all the way down the whole Mississippi region. There's been over 10,000 recorded earthworks and mounds. Up in New England, in America, you've got all the megalithic chambers and the dolmens around New York State, Connecticut, and all them kind of areas. And I've been exploring those as well, and they're absolutely fascinating. And then you spread that around the world, and it just doesn't seem to stop. It's almost like there was like a craze going on back in Neolithic times. Everyone had to build them. I had a friend who called me about a year ago. He never calls me. He's this guy he does research in Africa, but he went to Korea. He phoned me up out of the blue and said, Hugh, there's 19,000 dolmens in Korea. I got all excited by it. And so you realise the sort of magnitude of what we're dealing with here. And then you realise some of them aren't even still on land. They've been covered up by the sea. So some of them are potentially, between 8,000 and 15,000 years old. So the more you look, the more you find. And when you've got an eye for it, like I have and a lot of people, my colleagues, you realise there's a global phenomenon here. And this is kind of, what drew me into this idea that perhaps there was a global civilization, and perhaps they are connected somehow, whether through energy, whether through sort of grids or ley lines or whatever. There's certainly something going on, and it's definitely on a planetary scale.
Hugh, are there messages behind all these sites?
There seems to be messages, yeah. I mean, you look at the work of Karl Monk and you find codes within sites and how they relate to each other all around the planet. And when you come back to crop circles as well, you find there's messages that connect the crop circles and the ancient sites, that they seem to be using the same codes, the same maths, and the same geometry. And really, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, that is kind of the universal language. That's the sort of language which all life on all planets can recognize. When you sort of get back to the fundamentals, sacred geometry, math, and different formulae, and things like this. And so, yeah, I think there are codes in these sites, and I think, you look at the Great Pyramid, for instance. I mean, that's a classic example where the measurements, if you measure it all up carefully, and you realize all the incredible precision they've used in these sites, you realize there are codes in them, and they are maybe the ancients were trying to tell us something, or maybe they were sending a message through time, and there's been different speculations on this over the last few decades. So there's certainly something in that, and Stonehenge is another example. And you realize as you explore these sites further and look further into the mysteries of them, you find different levels. You find the level, one of the most interesting is the sacred geometry level, but another one, for instance, is the way they connect up over the landscape on a more sort of on a larger, grander level. And you realize, were they surveying in ancient times? And then that can stretch out around the whole planet, and you think, well, actually, was this a great survey that these very sophisticated, like astronomer priests, were doing in antiquity? And really, has it got anything to do with Atlantis? Does Atlantis come into this? Does Lemuria come into this? Or was it just a more practical, pragmatic kind of way they were working, where they were just literally trying to map their country, or they were trying to somehow harness the energies of the earth? There's lots of different aspects to these studies. That's why I think it's still such a fascinating mystery.
Hugh, how did these ancients get so technologically advanced, at least with their own, mind power? They all seem to understand things that not a lot of people understand today.
I know this is one of fascinating subjects that kind of grabs my attention constantly. The more you explore it, it's something that's one of the reasons me and my colleagues created this megalithomania event, so we could actually debate these issues, because there wasn't a platform for this to happen. So we put that together partly for that reason, just to sort of challenge the status quo, challenge the academics to ask that question. I mean, who were these people? How were they so sophisticated? And it baffles me, because you look at the construction techniques of, just again, if we go back to the Great Pyramid, you look at Cusco in Peru, or Sacsayhuamán in Peru, you realize some of these blocks are hundreds of tons. Some of them were moved from quite a long way away. So just from that perspective, just from an engineering perspective, you realize that it was a huge feat of engineering. And so today we couldn't even do it with some of the most advanced crane technology we have. And so to say, like the academics and the archaeologists, a lot of people still believe these primitive people, they were like cavemen. But I think we need to re-look at that completely. There's a whole paradigm shift is necessary to really understand, who we were, who our ancestors were.
They were cavemen with sophisticated tools, probably computers and slide rules.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I'm sure. These
sites, how were they selected? Because they all seem to have purpose.
This is where the grid theory comes in here, because we need to sort of question. We need to sort of step back and question. What did the sites? Did they choose the sites because it was convenient to them, or did they choose the sites because they were actually traveling on a global scale or on a national scale and surveying the land? So they put markers up, so then they could use one marker to another and triangulate their way across a country.
If you looked at the planet, Hugh, from space, where all these sites are, is there any pattern to it?
There seems to be a pattern forming. Yeah, the more you look into it, you realize there are patterns. I wouldn't say there's one universal pattern for the whole planet. There's a lot of sites that don't fit onto the grid, for instance, or the grids. But there seems to be sort of different levels of grids. There's some, like I say, some are national, some are more local, and some are global. And so you have to look at it from different perspectives, really, and also from different time eras as well, because you realize there's extremely ancient sites, like you get Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, Baalbek in the Lebanon, and other sites around the planet. With other sites in the Neolithic time, so they're like 4,000 or 5,000 BC, and others which are Bronze Age, a couple of thousand BC. So when you start looking at, I'm starting to research all the different levels of time to see if there's any correlations, see if different surveys or different scientific projects were carried out at different points in time. And so I think if you do map them all out over the planet, you do find patterns. And this is one of the things I've sort of looked into closely in all the different areas of that in my Earth Grids book. So I'll sort of go on into more detail about that in there. But there certainly are patterns there, yeah.
Tell me about these Earth energy sites and what kind of energy might be at these locations.
Well, this all fits into the grid theory as well, actually. There's two ways to approach the Earth energies when you're looking at sacred sites and ancient sites. There's one from a geomancer's perspective, like dowsing, where it's much more intuitive, and you're quite sensitive. You turn up with dowsing rods or pendulums, and you can find these energies and map them out like that. But there's been a whole scientific surge of research done over the last decade or so, where they've actually sort of verified a lot of what the dowsers and geomancers have been saying scientifically. And so if you just take, an example of a stone circle in Britain, for instance, you'll find that there are telluric lines or telluric energies going all across the landscape of Britain, all around the world, really. And they kind of get charged up by the sun as it rises every morning, and they strengthen and tighten. And the sites seem to somehow harness these kind of earth energy lines. And they carry like a weak DC current, so they have a slight electrical charge. And these alter, this electrical charge alters as it moves through different types of rock and soil and underground water and chalk, etc. And so you get different energy signatures. It becomes more magnetic and it becomes more electric charge. And often when there's an electric charge, where is what is called a conductivity discontinuity, which is something John Burke, author of Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty, covered in detail, is where a lot of sacred sites occur. And so you have to ask the question, were the sites put there because there was some kind of charge there, some kind of energy, and then they were either marking it from a more sacred or spiritual perspective, or perhaps it was a more scientific and pragmatic perspective where they were somehow using these energies. And there's a whole load of research which John Burke and Philip Callahan and others have done where they've actually realized that there could have been a fertility technology to charge up seeds, to enhance crops, and things like this, possibly even human fertility and animal fertility as well for farming. And so there's a lot of research done on that, and I could happily talk about that for some time as well. But yeah, there's certainly something to do with these earth energies. And if you look at it there's a great earth energy current or currents that go across southern England called the Michael and Mary energy currents. And they kind of go all the way from the Cornwall coast all the way up to the East Anglian coast. And there's evidence now that they go all the way around the planet. So somehow the ancients could have been harnessing global earth energy currents on a grand scale. So you have to come back to this idea of grids and these kind of theories, that was there a great civilization in prehistory that worked on a global level? And I really think there was.
And they knew about all these sites. Now, is the energy, can it be registered on equipment?
Yes, it has been. It's starting to happen now, actually. This is something that Burke and others have sort of put a lot of energy and time into. And it's brilliantly covered in their book, and other researchers have done it as well. I've got myself a small tri-field magnetometer, which I've been testing at sites. I take dowsing rods as well, and also compasses to see if there's any magnetic anomalies. And you do often find stuff going on, but yeah, I mean, Burke and others, they've been using very high-tech, thousands of dollars, pieces of equipment to record these energies, and they've had to spend days there picking up these energies, and they've got remarkable results. So yes, science is now coming around to what the geomancers and the dowsers have been talking about for decades.
Hugh, tell us what the significance is of having these energy forces and fields at these locations.
Well, the significance is quite important because there's a whole area, an invisible energy area of prehistory has never been looked at. And so it's only literally in the last decade starting to be looked at. And so we're really starting for the first time ever to get into the mindset of the ancient peoples and about how they were working and how they were working with these invisible energies. And so we must question ourselves about, if these sites were working then, isn't it interesting how they seem to be working now as well? I mean, 'cause all these energies that these scientific people have been exploring they're actually picking them up now still. Some of these sites were built between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, and so the significance is quite interesting. Because it also shows like a fertility technology of the ancients that we've only just rediscovered, and proves that they were sophisticated enough to harness these natural energies with these stone circles, with these mounds, with these earthworks all over the planet, and use it for a purpose that was pragmatic and useful to them.
That's just what I was going to ask you. If they harnessed it, if they had that ability, how did they use it in order to make their lives better or easier?
Well, one of the tests that John Burke done, and also Philip Callahan touched on this in some of his research, was they had actually placed seeds, standard seeds that may have been, they guessed were used by ancient peoples. They placed the seeds in these sites at different times of day. They had test ones, or they didn't put in the sites, and then went to plant them. And often the ones that went in the sites at a particular time of day, usually in the morning when the energies were strongest, when they went to plant these seeds against ones that weren't put in the sacred site, they get a much higher yield of crop and a much stronger plant, which grew quicker, often like 300% more crop. higher yield. So suddenly you realize that this was like an abundance technology that the ancients were using. And they were using it to it could have been capitalism back then. And they were producing more than they needed, and they would then sell it and become wealthy. And there's evidence of this in North America at some of the Native American sites that, going back just a few hundred years, some of this technology was still known about. So they were doing these tests, and people would come from hundreds of miles away to place their seeds, make offerings as such.
What happens, Hugh, if the individual stood at these points? What would happen to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is one of the most interesting aspects of this, because there's suggestions that because the fertility aspect of it is working on seeds, it could also work on humans. There's also a consciousness effect. And this is something that has been covered quite extensively by researchers such as Paul Devereaux, again, John Burke, some of his research. And you actually, if you go into these places where this kind of fertility energy is, or this charge, electric charge is, at the right time of day when it's strongest, and you're in the right spot where it happens, it can actually give you an altered state of consciousness. And often this is where there's markings on the wall, there's paintings and things like this that have been discovered in some of these sites. And so there could have been a sort of two-way sort of aspect to this even back in prehistoric times, and that they could have had an altered state at a certain point and realised this is the point where the energy is, this is where we put our seeds. It's also often where these points are as well. You get the orbs or the balls of light that have been talked about for hundreds, if not thousands of years in legends, especially in Britain. You get all the fairy, will-o'-the-wisp legends and things like this. And so these aspects of these balls of light are also definitely a part of this, and these appear at these particular points where the energy is strongest.
With these points, and you said they're all over the planet, were they always there since the formation of the planet, or were they put there?
That's a very good question as well. I mean, this is the grey area here. You have to ask, were the points kind of energized, and then the ancients recognized it as such and built on top of it, or did they place their sites there, and then that attracted the energies to them sites? And so that is a really unknown thing, because I know, for example, the crop circles. When you test the energies around crop circles before they appear, they're all random, really. But often when crop circles then appear, and you go there and douse the energies, douse the underground water, suddenly it all organizes itself into this coherent kind of pattern, which then becomes recognizable as a kind of, like an energy system. And so there is a chance that there could have been nothing there at all, and the sites attract the energy and alter it extensively. But again, this is a grey area. But I know, for example, people who build mazes or labyrinths, the same thing happens. It actually reorganizes the energies. And so there's certainly something in that, but it needs to be tested properly, really, to sort of comment on that effectively.
That is something. What is science doing about all this? Think about that, Hugh. I'll ask you that again when we come back. We're going to take this quick break. We're talking with Hugh Newman, his book, Earth Grids, his websites. Well, there are many of them, by the way, and they're all linked up at coasttocoastam.com. As for me, it's just coasttocoastam.com, and you can email me at george@coasttocoastam.com. With our guest tonight, Hugh Newman, we're going to talk about crop circles. We're going to get his take on where he thinks they come from, how they are made. That'll be next on Coast to Coast AM. Hugh, I'm curious to get your take on crop circles, how they may be made, what you think they are. What's the message behind them?
Yeah, crop circles, that's like the million-dollar question, that one.
Sure is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think these earth energies may be connected. And if you look into the history of crop circles, you'll find that they go back, several hundred years. I mean, near where I am in England, for instance, there's a woodcut called the Mowing Devil, which goes back to the 1600s, which appears to have what they thought the devil must have cut this kind of circular shape in this field. And there's other ones that go back to the 1930s, these strange lights appearing and things like that. And so one of the original ideas was that they were kind of like plasma vortexes. But I get a sense that there's obviously intelligence behind them the more you kind of look at the geometry and the design. there's also, it's always very much based on harmony and simple mathematics and sacred geometry. So it's almost like they're kind of, they seem to be coming, part of me thinks they're coming from the Earth somehow, whether they're coming from these energy lines, these Earth energy currents, and there's some intelligence behind that. The one theory I like is that the ancient sites were encoded and like programmed with certain messages way back several thousand years ago, because they're crystallized, so they can hold this kind of information, and that they're now being released by the megaliths through these Earth energy lines across the landscape into the actual fields themselves. Because it's not just crops you get them all in different parts of the world, in ice, in sand even. There's been some in Egypt that have occurred in sand and then disappeared quickly, obviously, and different ones in Norway on these big ice sheets. So yeah, I get a sense there's something to do with these Earth energies, and some people talk about the elemental realm as well, like the fairies, the elves, different kind of...
So I've always thought the planet is alive. You know, the Gaia theory, which is a subtitle of your book. And it's trying to communicate with us somehow. It's giving us messages. We haven't interpreted them yet, but that it's coming, as you just said, from within.
Yeah, certainly seems like that, yeah. There's certainly something going on there. And I think it's beyond, as human beings, it's beyond our capability to try and, get a grasp on that bigger picture. So it could be like, it could be like Gaia. Just putting them out there just to say, okay, humans, time to wake up. Here's how I'm going to try and help you bit by bit. It could even be a code that goes throughout the years.
Right.
Within crop circles, if you decode it one year to another and do them in a certain sequence. I'm not sure about that, but it'd be worth an interesting thing to look at.
I mean, I even wonder if the planet, Hugh, is trying to warn us about something, and that's its way of trying to communicate.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's certainly a good point. Yeah, I mean, there's some crop circles. This is something that my friend Jeff Stray's been looking into. He's like the sort of expert on 2012 and Mayan calendars, and he's convinced there's something going on with some of these crop circles that are kind of like prophetic, and there needs to be a sort of look at that from a group of like-minded people to try and decode them. So yeah, there could be something in that as well. Yeah, definitely.
Tell me the difference between the energies, the grids, the ley lines, or are they all one of the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's if we don't, it's like a classification issue. This really, it comes up a lot in these kind of studies. Ley lines or lays, which are technically called, is something that was originally discovered or rediscovered by Alfred Watkins in the 1920s, and all it was to him was a series of sites. They could be churches, ancient mounds, megaliths, earthworks, whatever, in a line which he would discover on a map. You can see from hilltops over a few miles, with about 5 or 6 sites in a row, and that they're lays, or ley lines as they're now become called. Whereas there's different types of lays. There's later, just a couple of decades ago, Sig Longren, who's a geomancer, he found what were called energy lays, because he would find particular beams of energy along these straight line alignments. And then you find there's the Earth energy currents, which appear to sort of wiggle about, and they're a bit more curvy, not often straight. This is the classic story of the St. Michael line that John Michel discovered in the late 60s, and potentially this is similar all around the world. It's a great line. It goes for over 300 or 400 miles long, and then 20 years later, these dowsers, Paul Broadhurst and Hamish Miller, went to investigate it, see if there was any energy associated with it. And they found these 2 great energy currents weaving around it like...
Well, we lost you. So we'll dial you right back. He's in the United Kingdom live, and he got clipped. He's probably right on one of the ley lines. So we'll try to get him right back here for you. We've got a couple phone numbers. With our guest, Hugh Newman, he's talking about his work, Earth Grids, where he believes that, of course, there are these ancient sites all around the planet, but that his theory is that an ancient civilization was responsible for all of them. So let's go back. You there, Hugh?
Yeah, I'm here, yeah. Sorry about that.
You must have been on a ley line yourself.
Yeah, something happened. I'm not sure what it was. I think it's full moon is happening right now.
Yeah, well, it's not only that. We got hit by an X flare from the sun, and it is having, it hasn't hit us directly, but who knows? You're out there in the United Kingdom, might have clipped you a little bit.
Yeah, I think it just clipped my head just then, or something on my phone.
Did you feel that?
Well, something strange happened, yeah.
Okay,
So,
well, anyway, we were talking about the ley lines and their significance.
and so, yeah, you have these, so you get the straight lays, or the ley lines, which Alfred Watkins rediscovered in the 20s. You get the energy lays, which Sig Longren has classified. And then you get these great earth energy currents that weave in and around, often around, like Caduceus, around the straight line alignments themselves. And so there's all these different classifications. Then you have the telluric currents, which are very chaotic and are linked to the magnetic field, which increase in strength and tighten up as the sun rises, and then weaken and loosen as the sun sets overnight. And they seem to all be linked to these ancient sites, as though they were trying to harness these energies. So there's certainly something within that. And often you get, with these energy currents and these telluric lines, and even the lays as well, crop circles and ancient sites always seem to be on them. And so there's some connection there. And then you have the grids. There's different types of grids around the planet. There's the Curry and Hartman grids, which are very close together, and the two different angles around the whole planet. And they kind of, like these rays of energy come off them. And also you have like the Becker and Hagen's, the UVG, or Unified Vector Geometry Projection, which stretches all around the planet and is like a combination of all the different platonic solids. So it gets very complicated as the further you go into it. But you do find correlations keep stepping in. And this is, I go into a sort of pace through this in detail in the book, in the Earth Grids book. So if anyone wants a more detailed analysis of that, it's quite an interesting little story how it all fits together.
Hugh, tell me about the psychic children that got you involved in Earth Grids research. Tell me, how did this all happen?
Well, I went to this conference in Hawaii in 2003, organised by James Twyman and others, and I was interested in this because I'd been, before that, I was at college in London. I got a couple of jobs babysitting some friends' kids, and they were indigo children. They were psychic children, and very, very incredible kind of kids, you know. And it kind of got me really inspired. So I thought, well, I'll go to this conference. And I travelled through Mexico and Guatemala for several months. I started my research on the Olmecs and the Mayans back then. But yeah, and I met them all there, and they deliberately chose Hawaii because it was a grid point, and it was one of the most powerful ones on the planet. It sits at 19.5 degrees as well above the equator.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
A lot of things hit at 19.5, don't they?
They certainly do throughout the solar system, yeah. And so that's a significant point, something that Richard Hoagland sort of inspired me with that.
You know what? He's listening to you right now, as a matter of fact. He's
hello there, Richard.
Sending me messages left and right about you. So
okay.
He likes you, by the way.
Oh, good. And so, yeah, so the conference there really inspired me. And there's a certain... one of the children, or she's like a young adult now, was Grandmother Chandra, and she really inspired me and got me tuned up to like this sort of elements of how the grid functions and how these kids work with it on a psychic level or a telepathic level. But I was quite interested in just the whole phenomenon of that. Oh, this is very interesting, and so that really sort of spun me into this whole idea of there being a grid. I was already into crop circles, ley lines, and things like that before then. I hadn't really kind of thought much about the grid until Grandma Chandra kind of really inspired me, and I did a bit of research and found that Hawaii is a particularly interesting place. The veil is very thin there on the Big Island. I couldn't sleep 5 or 6 days. It was such an intense energy there. And so that really kind of opened it up to me. And then the research just sort of cascaded from there. And it sort of developed quite quickly.
You know, the work that's been done by you and others about this, it's so obvious that there's something going on. It's fascinating to me why mainstream science hasn't picked up on this.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I hear what you're saying there. It does baffle me a little bit as well. But there is a potential. This is something that Bruce Cathie, who's another grid researcher from New Zealand, has been looking at, and he's convinced they do know all about all of this. They've got it down. They understand it all, but they want to keep it secret for themselves because they're actually using it for their own purposes. There's many different theories and speculations as to what that is. But, for example, Bruce Cathie thinks that the interaction that ETs have had with humans on the planet going back, a very long time. But specifically, he thinks the last 50 or so years, that these crafts that they come to Earth in, or he thinks there's underwater bases too, that they're actually using a certain grid to actually travel along and use the energy from that to actually power their crafts, to power their devices. So I find that rather interesting. And this is where you start getting into this whole anti-gravity or zero-point energy and things like this. And so I think there is a whole aspect to that which is being kept secret for a reason, because it's being used, not necessarily for the public, and which I think it should be.
Are you familiar with Coral Castle in Florida?
I've not been there, but yes, I am familiar with that place.
Okay. Old fella, he's not with us anymore. Edward Leeds Scullin, weighed 120 pounds, lifted pyramid-type size blocks all by himself. He knew something. I'm wondering, Hugh, if the position of where he put this castle, he moved it from one to another spot, but he may have known that they were on the grid or they were on ley lines, but it must have given him an ability to move these blocks, these huge blocks of stone, very effortlessly.
Yeah, I mean, the mystery of Coral Castle is one of the most fascinating, fascinating of the lot, really, especially because it's so modern. It's only like, 40 or 50 years ago. This kind of fascinates me. There's one aspect to that which is interesting, like which you said, which he moved his whole site to another place. And there's some grid theorists who believe that he moved it there specifically because that was much more powerful and he could get more gravitational effect there to move these blocks and do his kind of like magic, if you will. And he even admitted, like I'm sure many of your listeners know, that he was going to take to the grave the secrets of the pyramid builders. And
that's right.
Fortunately, he did. So we don't really know what happened, but I think he was somehow using magnetism and using the coral type rock, somehow charging it. So it would like two magnets, where one of them floats above the other. You can do a little experiment.
Well, he claimed that every object was magnetic. It didn't have to be metal or iron or anything like that. And he might be right.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, for sure.
Do you think extraterrestrials were involved in any of this?
There's a good chance of that. I haven't seen enough sort of solid evidence of that, but you can't help but have that as part of the grand theory here, because you look at what Bruce Cathie's already talked about, you look at obviously the work of Eric von Daniken and others, and there's a lot of evidence, and it kind of helps explain how they could have been so advanced such a long time ago and so sophisticated, where it doesn't fit in with the human story going back to prehistory. So there seems to be more and more evidence of that, and yeah, I mean, there's just certainly something in that. It's not something I've personally researched and studied essentially myself, but I think there's certainly a connection there.
Do we know if there have been any massive Earth changes or effects by any of these points?
Yeah, I mean, there's evidence that obviously the actual Earth crust has shifted. This is something that Charles Hapgood, Rand Flemath, and others have looked into quite carefully, and it's interesting because when you relate some of the ancient sites to where the poles used to be, like in Hudson Bay and other places, they align to where they used to be, the poles. And so that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. There's also, obviously, the magnetic poles seem to be fluctuating and moving about. So there's something in that as well, but I don't know how much that would affect the placement of sites. However, it could have been because stuff shifted in antiquity or in prehistory that they actually had to resurvey the planet and remap the planet. And so this could be why there's these different epochs of time. They've actually it looks like they've remapped the planet, rebuilt sites, repositioned them, etc. And so, yeah, it looks like there's certainly evidence of that.
Hugh, why is Giza so important to all of this?
I think Giza's essential to all this. It's almost like it's the center point of the planet from a geodetic or a geomantic perspective. Most of the major sites around the planet are somehow aligned to Giza, whether it be through distance, degrees, angles, or just simply because of the design of them and the era that they were built in. And the prime meridian, I believe, and many others, used to go through Giza, used to go through the Great Pyramid, and all maps and surveys and other major ancient capital sites were derived from that particular line, or even directly from Giza itself, and also it seems like it's the mother culture of the megalithic world. However, recent discoveries have found that potentially there are other sites which are much older than that. But I think Giza became the sort of megalithic capital and maintained that for quite a long time.
What about the Sphinx? Does it have any special meaning where it is?
Well, the Sphinx is interesting because of the dating of it. I find absolutely fascinating. Obviously, it's probably been on your show quite a lot. This is like people like Robert Schoch and
Sure.
West who've sort of decoded it and believe it's 10,000 years or older. So that is interesting in itself because that puts that in the same era as places like Göbekli Tepe or Nabta Playa in southern Egypt and various other potential sites around the world. The alignment of it is like something that Robert Bouval's cracked, and he believes it used to face the Leo constellation at 10,500 BC, and so that I find particularly interesting. And I believe, with him and Graham Hancock, they decoded many of the sites around the planet fitting in with that theory, and that does make a lot of sense to me because when you're mapping and when you're surveying the planet and sailing around the planet and doing all this kind of work, you have to use the stars for navigational tools, but you can also use them to help map the surface of the planet. It's almost acts like a mirror as such, and so it is a useful tool. So, and then they found these beautiful boats outside the Great Pyramid. They found several of them all around it. One of them you can go and see in this sort of little museum they've got there. And so so I think it was proof that they were using archaeoastronomy or ancient astronomy to kind of verify their findings, but also that they were using it for traveling and mapping around the entire planet.
I think so now. Here, were they mapping it from above? Did they have that kind of capability?
Well, it's quite possible. There's the whole story of the Vimana aircraft.
Sure, yeah.
Ancient India and things like that. So it wouldn't surprise me. And if they can build pyramids like that, they can build megalithic sites like they have done, no reason they can't get up in the air somehow, even if they're just using sort of balloons and things like that.
Had a bizarre story last week of a Vimana that they found in a cave in Afghanistan, but they can't get it out, and soldiers have disappeared trying to it. It is a bizarre, probably mythological story, but it's weird.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating. Well, I'd like to see how that one unfolds, yeah.
As you began to do more and more research into this, Hugh, what began to... Something must have popped out, and you said, oh, my, look at this. Was there one area?
Yeah, basically, the thing that really popped out for me was the fact that there seems to be a sort of global scientific project, if you like. There seems to be there's something behind, there's like a force or a consciousness or a group behind it who seem to be highly sophisticated, very compassionate, and they wanted to do good for all. And I found that's what compelled me, that there was something going on here and there was a reality to it.
Well, last year when NBC commissioned Richard C. Hoagland to do a little investigation into the 2012 dilemma, he was taking measurements. And, of course, Hugh Newman just mentioned Richard C. Hoagland. So Richard's going to join us for this hour with Hugh Newman as we talk about these ley lines and grids. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. We've got Hugh Newman with us, author of Earth Grids, and, of course, none other than the head of the EnterpriseMission.com and our science advisor, Richard C. Hoagland. Hey, Richard.
Good morning, George.
Good morning. See, this is what you get for IMing me during the show. Because
hi there, Hugh.
Hey, Richard.
Nobody outside of Hugh understands this subject matter, Richard, better than you. And when he mentioned
Graham Hancock.
Well, when he mentioned 19.5, I said,
oh yeah, well, come on, 19.5, yes. No, that was a magic point. When Hugh got to that point, it was like, aha!
Tell us, when you got commissioned by Sci-Fi NBC to do the 2012 special, and you were taking measurements, tell me what that was all about.
Okay, I get to give a little background here so people aren't lost. Well, Hugh, you mentioned electromagnetic effects from these sacred sites earlier?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Okay, you are aware, of course, that those are secondary effects, that there's a primary energy transfer going on, which the Russians and a few American guys and a couple of Europeans and nobody really currently in the field except us, which we'll get to in a minute, have actually been measuring. And then you get these structures, to my thinking, the way I'm looking now at this physics, which has a tremendously venerable history, certainly in Russia, is the primary energy transfer in the universe, and the EM stuff that we all think, meaning we the mainstream guys, think is primary is in fact secondary. So these things are transducers. These things are amplifiers, or if you want to use a really, interesting term out of radio, George, they're transponders.
Huh.
What they do is they take in torsion energy, they amplify it, they re-radiate it, which has effects on the immediate and global vicinity, which we'll get to in a second, because Hugh really went into some of those things very nicely earlier in the show. And then they generate EM, electromagnetic stuff, as a kind of a noisy side effect. So when you see these shows like, Ghostbusters and, the folks that look at megalithic monuments or the folks that are looking at, haunted hotels, they're detecting the after effect of torsion as a secondary electromagnetic thingy, and because Western physics has deliberately, by political intrigue, a la the intelligence agencies, been kept in the dark regarding torsion. If you ask the average Russian physicist, he's familiar with torsion. The average American guy will say, "What? Is that a new bar down the street?" So there's a real time lag between the parts of the community, speaking now of science in general, as to how to properly analyze and interpret what you're measuring when you get in the field and measure. Now, Hugh, have you actually tried any of these measurements yourself?
Yeah, I've got a very basic piece of equipment called a tri-field magnetometer.
Okay.
And sometimes you do get results with that. It's very portable. You can just take it along in your pocket. I do get results from that perspective. I'm very much into dowsing and geomancy, so I tend to work from that level as well, and have been for many years. And I'm surrounded by a lot of people who research that. So that's the kind of angle I come at it from. And whereas I personally tend to kind of look at other people's scientific research and sort of fit that in to my research. So I'm very interested in this stuff you've been looking at, Richard.
Well, that's what I was going to get to. George, I want to now get directly to your question, because the key theory, the key model, the key idea behind torsion physics is that physical constants, the kind that we read in the back of the textbooks when we're in high school, like the speed of light and the ratio of the electronic charge to the magnetic charge of the electron, et cetera, all these things are supposed to be constant, inviolable, forever the same now as they've been from the day the universe was born. The torsion model says that's not so, including constants like mass, inertia, and the derivative, which is a gravitational field. So when I went with Robin, because they were very kind to send my doctor with me, and we had a lot of fun and got a lot of interesting, exciting stuff that Robin, of course, is going to do her whole thing on the 2012 cruise, so we can talk about that later if you want.
I still don't know how you did those 400 steps plus.
Because I'm in good shape, and I have the best doctor in the world, and of course that's how I did it. And it's on television. Remember what Gene Roddenberry said, George? If it's real, it will be on television.
Yes, it was. You went up with those
400 steps is on television. So, yes, I've got a very good doctor. So here's what we did. We took the basic Russian theory, which goes all the way back to Einstein and Cartan, almost at the turn of the century. Everybody, of course, knows who Einstein is, right? Well, these two guys, physicists, Einstein and a guy named you don't know, named Cartan, developed a field theory implying that torsion, under certain circumstances, would be generated and would be detectable by current instrumentation through this electromagnetic side effect, which allows you to measure the stuff that you can't measure directly.
All right, and what do you mean by, because a couple of people are sending me fast blasts, what do you mean by torsion?
Torsion is a twist.
Okay.
Remember the hula hoop?
Yeah.
Remember the dance? The twist?
Are you trying to get me to admit that I did it?
Yes.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Anyway, torsion is a twisting, rotating wave in the space-time continuum.
Okay.
But it's not an EM wave. It's a torsion wave. It's the fabric of, the stuff the universe, it turns out, is really all made of.
Does it have rhythm to it?
It has, of course, it has a frequency, it has wavelength, it has energy, it has information transfer characteristics. It does all kinds of really cool things, provided you figure out how to make the right detector. So what I did was to put together the Russian work and Bruce De Palma's work, my old friend, and I created, and then I had a friend of mine build it, a detector that was based on what torsion fields do that electromagnetic fields don't do. And torsion fields change inertia. They change mass. The perception of mass changes depending upon the torsion environment in which you're measuring mass. And a rotating object is quintessentially the best detector for torsion fields because they're also rotating, i.e. the twist. So I went to the state of the art, and I thought, what could I use to measure the changing inertia? And coming off the work of a French genius named Allais, who got the 1988 Nobel Prize for Economics, but he really wanted to be a physicist all along, so he's done some stunning award-winning work in France. He measured a torsion effect with a pendulum going all the way back to 1954 during a total solar eclipse over Paris. Well, pendulums are kind of complicated and cumbersome to carry around, right, George?
They sure are.
So I thought, what could I do that would be the equivalent of a pendulum, but would be small, solid state? You could interface with a computer. It could almost fit in your pocket. You could take it in the field. You could run up and down pyramids. And then ding, 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 I went back to the work of my friend Bruce De Palma, and he had it. It was called the Accutron wristwatch. And instead of having a normal escapement like all watches or having a quartz crystal like the modern ones, it had a mechanical tuning fork that hummed, vibrated back and forth at 360 cycles per second. Now, there's a very simple equation relating mass and how much force you apply to an object to make it move.
By the way, your French economist just died.
Oh, damn.
Just a few months ago.
Oh, that's a shame. I was hoping we could get to where his work would be validated worldwide by some of the measurements we're doing. But we will continue.
All right. Go ahead.
Anyway, when you see the work of Allais, you'll see why he deserves to have his name up in 20,000-foot high lights because of his seminal research, which was ignored by everybody except Werner von Braun. And the whole story of Allais.
Maurice Allais.
I'm thinking of Jacques, Allais with an A. He and von Braun got together, and von Braun brought his work for the first time to the aerospace community here in the 1960s in a major aerospace journal translated from French into English.
All right, now convert this with what Hugh's been telling us
I'm about to get to the punchline.
All right.
So, using the approach of measuring changes in inertia of a tuning fork, when Robin and I took, on the crew, took this gear up the Great Pyramid there in Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, assisted ably by Jaime Mousson, by the way, who's an old friend of yours and mine.
Right.
I was able to record in the computer and show on the screen and have, of course, access data now to use in other projects, absolutely unequivocal, documented, recorded data indicating that the frequency of that little accutron changed by over a factor of 1,000 to 1 in the space of seconds or of a second. The graphs up and down, the coincidence with sunrise when the pyramid under us literally sang and you saw this huge spike of energy and frequency increase just at dawn, Hugh. I mean, to have real science able to measure real energy transfer in this realm where people think we're all touchy-feely idiots that don't know how to do the kind of field work that will give us the data we need. I'm very glad to see that our work and your work is now coming together tonight on Coast, where it's appropriate to come together. and that George, as the impresario he is, has allowed me to describe for the first time in some detail what it is we measured and why I'm so keenly interested now in this idea of a global energy resonant communicating grid of ancient edifices, ancient sacred sites, because my model is that what we're seeing in Egypt is being sparked in part by the amplifying effects of the Great Pyramid sitting right there just outside town, resonating with the changing background torsion field, and the model predicts there should be other interesting weirdnesses at nodal points, tetrahedral nodal points, if you measure starting with the Great Pyramid. And as I send a note to George tonight, Paul Ryan, who is a major representative in the U.S. House of Representatives, having been elected, in this Republican transition, and he holds a very key position. I forget what his committee position is, but Paul Ryan noticed tonight and said on I think Fox, Cairo has moved to Madison. Because Madison, Wisconsin, if you count around the equator, around the longitude lines from Cairo to the longitude Madison, Wisconsin is on, if you trace it down to 30 north, it's exactly 120 degrees and change from Giza. It is one hyperdimensional tetrahedral whatever's going on in the torsion field wavelength over from Giza, and you're having people in the mainstream look at Madison, Wisconsin tonight and say, oh, my, Cairo has come to America. We're in for one heck of a ride, George.
I think so, too. He's, by the way, chairman of the House Budget Committee.
Yes.
And, Hugh, what do you think of this? Richard's talking very similarly to what you've been doing.
Yeah, well, I just think it absolutely, not only does it back up the sort of areas I've been looking in, it gives a whole other dimension to research in now, I think.
Pun intended.
I mean, my brain was sparking when you were talking about that, Richard. So there's something in me. Yeah,
I figured it might.
Yeah, so I think, that's it just seems like there's a whole other dimension. I think this is the nature of where we're going with studying these sites and studying any of this kind of phenomenon, really. We need to take it to the next step.
Now, here's the next step. Robin and I, after we did, courtesy of MSNBC, Central America, we came to England. And I used the same equipment, and I tried to measure in Avebury the stones. And, of course, everybody knows who's, gone crop circle hunting or whatever in England or looked at these monuments, that in the middle of Avebury, which is, you basically have a village, in the middle of the village, you have one very good pub. So we arranged to have lunch in the pub, and I arranged for Graham Hancock and Sampla to meet us, and one of his sons, I think it was Luke, and we were all talking about what the measurements were going to do, and Graham was going to watch and be a kind of a monitor and a witness. And I set up the equipment in the pub, and the signal, Hugh, was so strong it broke the accutron.
No way, really? Wow.
I had to bring it all the way back to the States months later and get it fixed. Because, yes, so I've got a little bit of data, just like 10 seconds. And Graham watched open-mouthed this little thing that you would never think would be useful in this modality. It's the perfect way to measure changes in inertia in a torsion field, and those stones are so amplifying that energy in England. And I obviously had on my vision that Robin and I would go down and do Stonehenge. Well, you can't measure torsion fields with a broken torsion field detector. So that kind of got scrapped. So we still have that yet to do. So if we come back to England, which there's some rumors we might be doing something this fall, I'm going to give you a holler, and maybe we can go and complete what I think is some very important work for both of us.
Richard, Hugh has talked about how he believes ancients may have been able to handle all of this planet-wide. What do you think of that?
I think he's on the right track. We have a very Victorian, now I'm going to beast on Britain, right, Hugh? We have a very weird Victorian mindset, which came to us from England in the 19th century, good old Victorian England, that history and life has been one ending upward incline of progress, from the cave to the moon, that kind of thing. And what Hugh and Graham and I and a whole bunch of other researchers, Robert Bivol and I'm going to miss people, so I won't name any more, but there's a lot of people now looking at the serious idea, and I got to mention Joseph Farrell because I just remembered him. He's probably listening tonight. who have really glommed onto the serious idea that we are not the first, that we were preceded, meaning we, this civilization, by previous epochs of high-tech knowledge, insight, etc. And I think that's an absolutely correct model, and we got tons, overwhelming data, Michael Cremo et al., that is correct. The problem is, was it a technologically high-tech civilization? In other words, what kind of tech was it? And if you change the torsion constant too much, George, you wind up with everyday telepathy, telekinesis, the lack of a need for food, etc. In other words, you end up in the golden age of the yugas or the old Platonic cycles. And it's the change in the background physics which makes this possible, which, of course, for a 20th century archaeologist, you guarantee that they will freak out if you start talking about changing physical constants and changing human capabilities and creating an environment where consciousness, you think of something and it appears, is the normal state of affairs. That's why this part of the Yuga cycle is called the Kali Yuga. It's the deepest, lowest frequency where nothing much can happen, and we're basically in a consciousness prison, according to the Vedas, until we get out of this part of the cycle, which is an astronomical celestial thingy, which we're going to talk about on the cruise because it's connected intimately to 2012 and potential changes in consciousness coming very rapidly. So you look at the world, George, and you look at what's going on now, all sparked by what went on in that little tip of Africa.
No doubt, something's going on.
Thank God, something. You're seeing what everybody has to see, which is something's going on, and this audience, because of you and the researchers you bring forward, is uniquely positioned to tell your friends and neighbors and family and all the people who are going to be very worried and nervous and upset about change, how this change is proceeding, and there will be indicators, and obviously we will be providing, clues and things to look for, and science is nothing if it's not prediction. So if it's the physics which is activating this global network of solid-state torsion transducers, if I can use a 21st century term tonight, then all I can say is we are in for one hell of a ride, and the doomsayers haven't a clue as to where this actually can go. And what we're seeing in the streets of Cairo and the streets of Madison, I think, is a major clue to where this might actually be headed.
We'll be back with Richard C. Hoagland and Hugh Newman. In the last hour, Hugh will take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. We'll take your phone calls with Hugh Newman next hour. We'll be back with him, Richard C. Hoagland, as they talk about Earth grids, the secret patterns of Gaia's sacred sites. Hugh, you've been researching the Olmecs of Mexico. How come? Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I went over there originally in 2003 because I was fascinated by the Mayan site, the pyramids, of course. But when I started looking into that over the last few years, especially when you start looking into the megalithic sciences and art, you realize that there was a prehistoric culture in Mexico and even into Guatemala and down into South America as well. And that really fascinated me because they're potentially the oldest civilization known in Central America. They predate the Mayans, and they even, there's suggestions now, and there's quite good proof carved in stone, that they originated the long count calendar, the one that ends in December 2012, begins in 3114 BC. And they were around maybe 1800 BC, around that era. And there's other sites around Mexico City like Coatzacoalcos and Cholula and others, which are partly dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, and they don't seem to be of native origin, the Olmecs, which is absolutely sort of blows me away. So it suggests diffusionism, it suggests traveling around the world, again, going back to this idea of mapping sites. And you look at the megalithic stonework there and the incredible colossal heads, and they're huge. Some are up to 40 tons, and they look like they're African. They don't look Native American.
Strange.
American at all. So There's also carvings where they show what look like white people with beards. And they're obviously not native. You don't get bearded people in that part of the world. And so this opens up a whole load of questions about the origins of the Mayans, the origins of the Mayan calendar, the one that's going to end, the calendar that's going to end next year. And there's a whole mystery within that. And there's a project or a book I'm researching now is called Before the Maya. And I've got a DVD I've already done about that. It's on the website. But I'm developing the research. And I'm working alongside with Jeff Stray as well. And Mark Healy's also helping me with the research. He's done a couple of brilliant books about 2012. And so there's a whole world there before the Maya that really needs to be looked at again, just from a sort of archaeological or historical perspective at least. But there's proof as well, if you go to sites like San Lorenzo up on the Gulf Coast, that they were working with these kind of energies we've been talking about in the first hour. There's definitely evidence that they were working with these fertility energies, they were working with earth energies, and they were using it for various purposes. They were also very much into the sort of magic mushrooms of Mexico, and there's evidence now that they were even ingesting excretions from the Bufo marinus toad, which is 5-MeO-DMT. So the visionary aspects of their culture, again, are very interesting. But there's so little on this culture. There's so little out there. There's only a few books being written about it. That it's really hard to sort of find much evidence. And also because of the tropical climate of the Gulf Coast, many of the artifacts and the bones and the grave goods and things like this have all been eaten up by that climate. And so there's little to go on apart from the few bits and pieces that are there. And I visited all the Olmec sites, all the museums. I did a full sort of survey of all that area last year for a few months, and was absolutely blown away by it and amazed how few people visit these sites and how everyone's just into the big Mayan sites, which are much, much later and much less sophisticated, megalithic sort of stone carving perspective. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about with that whole subject. For sure.
How advanced were they compared to other civilizations throughout the planet at the time?
But at that time, and we'll be looking at between 1,500 and 1,800 BC, there is evidence of some places a little bit older than that. There's a place in Guatemala, near Guatemala City, which is 2,500 BC, which then becomes contemporary with the Great Pyramids in Giza, Egypt, and also with Stonehenge and a later part of Avebury. So there is kind of a megalithic connection there. And there is definitely, for example, just one good way of looking at it, I went to the Jalapa Museum, which is the main town just north of Veracruz, where they've got most of the Olmec finds, mainly from San Lorenzo and a few from Tres Zapotes and some other sites. And when you go in there and you look at the most ancient stones, the most ancient statues and artifacts, megaliths in there, the most oldest ones are the biggest by far. And as you walk through the museum, you get sort of nearer and nearer to the present day, gradually going through different eras of history, up to the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and up to medieval times and things like this. And suddenly everything gets smaller and smaller. So it seems like the ancient technology of megalithic construction and stone carving was the ancient that kind of appeared in Mexico with the Olmecs, or possibly before that, completely intact. And then you have to question as well the origins of the calendar, which begin in 3113 BC. There's no real evidence that they were there that early, but because the calendar starts, then you have to think, well, why would they start that calendar then? And then you sort of get into the whole sort of question of, was there a cataclysm? They were marking when it happened, and all their partly their calendars were based on when the next one may happen. With it ending in 2012, we need to sort of have a think about that as well, I think. So, certainly a lot to consider.
Richard, did any of your evidence show of some kind of calamity that might have occurred during the Mayan period?
Mayan cultural history, I'm looking at the celestial correspondences with the Tree of Life, the galactic alignment that John Major Jenkins has talked so much about. But one of the things I wanted to say to Hugh that I would be cautious about is the absolute numbers in your timeline. Because if we are correct, if the torsion field changes and this pyramid network all over the world amplifies it, and the changes in the background are cyclic, higher and lower, change in amplitude or in frequency, which is much more likely, then the dating via radiocarbon techniques, remember, there are no constants in HD physics. Radiocarbon dates are not reliable. I'll repeat, they're not reliable. When Robin and I were standing on the top of the Pyramid of the Moon, George, if you ever been to Teotihuacan, have you been there?
I was in Cancun.
You got to get to Teotihuacan.
But I'm not sure I went there.
You'll never forget that you were there when you're there. Anyway, it's kind of like a false front western town. It's like something out of Cecil B. DeMille, because when they excavated the pyramids, they did all of them except the backside of the Pyramid of the Moon, Hugh.
Wasn't that entire area all underbrush for a while?
Yeah, basically it looked like scrubscape and little hills and bushes and trees, and there's a huge Mexican effort, and there's an enormous story which Peter Tompkins has told so brilliantly in his book on the Mexican pyramids. I presume you've seen that, right, Hugh?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Tompkins is almost impeccable in terms of being one of the first guys to do serious, real research on this. But the point I was going to make is, if the physics isn't constant and the radiocarbon dates are not constant, and you can't say then that the Olmec culture extended back to maybe 1800 BC, because it's probably much, much, much too young. These cultures are all much older. And you know how I know, Hugh? Because when Rob and I stood there on the top of the pyramid looking down at the back side, the side they haven't excavated, George, there are tens of feet of soil and earth and trees and grass and bushes and little bunnies and rabbit and all kinds of wildlife living in a natural environment on stuff that has somehow accumulated on these stone structures in just a few hundred years.
Yeah.
So I said to my producer and the crew, take these shots. This is the visual proof, the official dating scheme sanctioned by the archaeologists all over the world and agreed to, which is false. For some reason, they've agreed to a false piece of data, because anybody can stand there and say, wait a minute, that much earth could not accumulate in a few hundred years. That's almost, the time back to some of our ancestors in Europe. It's like we can think back to great-great-great-great-great-grandma. You're telling me that 20 feet of earth accumulated on pyramids in the time since great-great-great-great-grandma died?
Sure. I don't know. What, Hugh, you've been to Giza, haven't you?
Well, we're talking now Mexico.
I know, but the sands, for example, that covered the Sphinx, how long do you think that took?
But that's a totally different process.
Yeah, just going back to what Richard was saying, it's interesting because if we just relate what you're saying, Richard, to Quilquilco, which is a circular period,
the big guy,
just south of Mexico City, which you can actually on the subway. There's a lava flow that's been covered part of the pyramid there, and what they found is that is 7,000 years old. And so it suggests that, that's a good bit of dating, because it's quite easy to, and they found certain artifacts within it. And originally, when they first dated it, was over 7,000 years old. And then they redated the later lava flow, and it was 2000 BC. And then now they agree it's like 50 AD for some reason. And so I like the idea of this torsion field and this dating, but until there's more evidence of that. I tend to go along with the standard dating just to sort of maintain agreement with others.
Wait. I can actually point you to papers on the web by absolute reputable scientists. In fact, one of them happens, I think, to be in Wisconsin, who have proven with laboratory experiments that radioactive decay theories are not constant. And he's done it because he's done a wonderful set of empirical experiments, but his theory for why it works has to do with tachyons, not torsion fields. But it's the data that's important, and you get this very nice, rhythmic up and down to the background radioactive decay of I forget which isotopes, and he attributes it to being closer or farther from the sun in the course of 1 year, when in fact it's indicating the changing interaction of the torsion field of the sun and the Earth and its orbit, and the data is beautiful, and so the model is basically confirmed, and the Russians have done tons of data. There are decades, but this is an American paper by American researchers, so I think that for an American audience, which we also talk to here, it would be appropriate to know that this is really peer-reviewed stuff and not an airy-fairy idea, and it will change everything in terms of archaeological dating when the mainstream finally gets it.
Okay. So how would the ancients have recorded torsion fields?
That's a really good question. If we're dealing with tens of thousands of years as opposed to a few hundred, if we could somehow take a time machine, Hugh, and portal back our technology, our equipment, flat screens, accutrons, cell phones, computers, whatever, to that era, and then we tried to dig up the remains, all you'd have is a few little piles of rust. Nothing metallic, nothing that we would recognize as technology would survive if these cultures are thousands and not just hundreds of years old, which I really think is what's going on.
Skyscrapers would be gone.
Everything. In fact, there's a wonderful set of series, World Without People, on I think it was History Channel or maybe it was Travel or whatever, but there's been a couple of series on major networks showing the incredible transient effects of human civilization on the planet and how even things like the Eiffel Tower in 100 years will be gone. And what you do is you basically be doing an analysis like we're doing with the Mir rovers on Mars, where you do sampling of the chemistry and you say, oh, there was a skyscraper here at one point. See what I mean? However, we have a major, huge clue in the data that Robin and I found when we went to Guatemala, which I'm going to present in my presentation on the cruise, which unequivocally proves, I will challenge anyone to refute what I'm going to lay out, that the Maya had to have known something about the physics of how those pyramids they built worked, because one of their major guys has told us, and no one until I looked at it realized what the message was trying to say. And so I'll be presenting that on the cruise in a couple of weeks.
Why aren't you inviting Hugh on the cruise?
Well, because I'm not in the position to invite people. I'm just showing up, George. It's not my party.
You can recommend.
I can strongly recommend, and I will be doing so. I recommended some other people, and, it's Hoagland proposes and other people dispose.
Hugh, let me get your take with regards to the Mayan calendar end date, 2012. Do you expect anything to happen during that period?
That's a very good question, and I feel the closer we get to it, I think the more people are realizing actually there probably is going to be a 2013. What fascinates me when we're looking at that particular end date is correlating that with the start date and what was actually going on then. Because if the Mayans and the Olmecs were so brilliant at this time science, they were working with these great cycles of 5,125 years, this particular one. And so if we refer back to 3,113 BC and work out what was going on then, I get a sense that it's very similar. They were in a very similar state, a sort of semi-golden age then, and that we're approaching that now, and we have the potential to go back into that.
What about worldwide catastrophes? Do you see that?
That's the other side of the coin I was just going to mention, because in 3,113 BC, I understand, I heard some reports, some data, that there was an asteroid hit in Austria about 20 years before 3,113 BC. And then from that period onwards, the megalithic culture of the world just went into overdrive. Soon after, the pyramids were started being constructed, Avebury was being built, Stonehenge, and all around the world this started happening. And so potentially they were sort of panicking and trying to record when the next cycle of this catastrophe may happen. And perhaps they did pinpoint it to around the 2012 time. So whether that was catastrophe like the Austria thing, or whether it was actually pole shift, whether the Earth crust displacement, they could have even been marking a shift in consciousness. We really don't know. And so there's the whole 2012 element is so fascinating. There's many people who've been researching it much more than I have. Jeff Stray's one of them. Mark Healy's another one who's running the Peace 2012 project. And I think we're at a real sort of potential here to actually use this end date for our own good.
Yeah, you're right. Not a lot of people think it's going to end in a catastrophe. Richard, what about you?
No, I'm not the catastrophe kind of guy, even though that's what sci-fi tried to edit.
They wanted you to do that, yeah.
What I've been looking at is there a potential for catastrophe? And the story, George, is, in the big term, it's still out. We don't know what could happen with total unprecedented non-warning. Look in the consciousness realm, I'll give you an example. Look at Egypt. None of the major pundits or minor pundits, politicos, anthropologists, people who are expert on the Middle East, people at the UN, people at, anywhere in positions of authority, predicted Egypt. It just suddenly, bing, the night that Obama gave his State of the Union, suddenly Egypt erupts. That was not modeled. It was non-fractal. It was like chaos theory, where you suddenly have something happen that you cannot model. That may be what 2012 is going to be, where there are things that can happen that cannot be modeled. The most easily understandable, I think, is that if you're changing frequencies of the background field that modulates our consciousness has to change as a result.
See, that is the $64,000 pinpointed question and answer, because something's changing consciousness right now.
Yeah, and it's not the same in every locale. That's important to watch the details, to not do what the pundits have done and to lump all Mid-East revolutions now as the same thing. They're not. The Egypt thing in my model is unique. Hugh, I think you'd agree that big thing in their backyard must have some effect. And then to find another counterpart going on at exactly 120 degrees around the Earth to the west at the same longitude line, which is Madison. And then you have a representative in Congress basically saying Cairo is erupted in Madison, meaning he gets it. He sees the similarities. No one's going to get to the understanding mechanics except those of us that have done the work. But the general effect that people in this audience tonight should be watching is for more indications of non-expected behavior.
That's a good point. If you want to go on a cruise with Richard C. Hoagland for a week, just go to theenterprisemission.com, because it's a March cruise all about 2012. But the cruise is this year. It's next month, as a matter of fact. I'll be back in a moment with more with Hugh Newman. We'll take your phone calls. His book is called Earth Grids. It's a good read, by the way. Hugh, I have to keep coming back to crop formations. Do they hold any answers here to these mysteries?
I think they hold a remarkable amount of knowledge within them. And I mean, to be honest with you, it's one of the reasons I personally got into this whole megalithic and esoteric subject, really. The more you look into them, you find them, they're amazing, they're paranormal, ETs made them to start with. And then you start exploring them, studying them, you start realizing the landscape, the ancient sites connected with them, the ley lines, the earth energies. You go into the sacred geometry. You realize there's mathematical codes and possibly messages within them. And then you realize there's possibly calendar dates in them. That's just something that Jeff Stray and others have looked at. And then you realize, are they actually connected with one crop circle to another? Do they sort of lead on to one another, like stringing a sentence together over a whole summer or over several years? And so I find the more you look into them and the more you look at it from the universal language perspective, i.e. mathematics and geometry, you start uncovering certain things in them, which is quite fascinating. And remarkably, they're very similar to the same kind of math and geometry you get in the ancient sites, in the pyramids, Stonehenge, and other stone circles, and other places around the world. And so I find the connection there remarkable. And now crop circles are appearing in North America, all over Europe, and different parts of the world. But for some reason, the hub of them, the high majority of them, seem to still appear in Wiltshire and around Avebury and around Stonehenge, which are two of the most impressive stone circles on the planet. So I find that quite fascinating in itself, why they all seem to congregate there. Why is that? And this is one of the sort of mysteries which is sort of, it kind of sort of baffles me constantly. It could be because there's the most stone circles there are than anywhere else on the planet, congregated around that particular area. It could be because the energies are particularly potent there. It could be because the sites themselves have encoded knowledge in them, and they're now coming out of the stone somehow, and actually spreading out through the landscape. So there's lots of things to consider here, and I find it, the more you look into it, the deeper you have to go with it, and it's almost like a demonic reality where the further you look into it, it kind of jumps to another level of complexity or sophistication, which you then have to study from scratch again.
Why does it seem these crop formations appear in England more than any other spot? They're all over the planet, but in England, they're everywhere.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they particularly appear just in the sort of Wiltshire, the Wessex kind of area. No one has got an answer to that, to be honest with you. But they do appear all over Britain in different parts, in East Anglia, in other places, and different parts around the world. There have been some in Europe and North America, particularly. Sort of the ones that interest me, because they're usually linked to the mound culture, the sites along, the Mississippi mound culture region, all the way down through the center part of America. So more and more are appearing, and this fascinating, superb designs. You get Italy and places like that as well. So why they happen in England mostly, it's a mystery, but there's something to be said about the ancient megalithic sites here and how the power that they seem to hold over the landscape.
All right, we're going to take phone calls now with Hugh Newman. Hugh, by the way, the book Earth Grids, where do you get it?
You can get it on the Megalithomania website, megalithomania.co.uk/HughNewman.html. You can get it direct, signed copies. You can get it on Amazon in America, but often they don't have it in stock. It's best to get it direct from the website, and then we send it out personally, signed and everything. So
I got to tell you, with Borders in this country closing a third of its stores soon, Amazon.com is going to take off like a rocket ship with these books.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, let's go to the phones. Bob is in Orlando, Florida, and you'll get us started here. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I wanted to know, has you been to Florida lately?
Have you been to Florida?
I've not been to Florida, no, but I really want to go because Coral Castle's there, and there's some interesting stuff in the Everglades, and there's some other ancient sites that have sort of been built over I'm interested in.
We also have some cut stone road down here that no one's talked about yet.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Tell me about that, Bob.
Well, I discovered it about 20 years ago. I thought it was a boat ramp in the middle of the Swanee River, and it goes across the bottom of the river and into the riverbank. I don't have a digging team to dig it out to figure out how far it goes.
What's your guess? How long is it?
Oh gosh, I can't determine. I mean, I think it's older than the Miami Circle.
Wow.
Oh, really?
And there's some cut stone road in Kentucky that someone found, and as a paleontologist was digging up a tar pit, decided to dig a little bit deeper, and he found himself a section of cut stone road. No idea where it goes, and no idea how it got there, and it was older than the tar pit.
That's incredible. You got to get us some pictures on that, Bob, can you?
I don't know about the tar pit piece. I can get you some pictures on the one for Swanee. I had to go diving to get them. By the way, there's a city in the Caribbean, a sunken city about 2,500 feet down on the bottom of the ocean down there, in the middle of the Caribbean.
Is this the Bimini Road you're talking about, that kind of area?
Yeah, that area, but it actually leads to an actual city that the Navy took pictures of. I've seen the photographs.
What's the city look like?
It's crossed between Aztec and something else, but I'm not sure what.
So it's pretty ancient then.
Yes, it is very ancient. There's a road that goes across the bottom of the ocean that no one's talked about either. It goes from Caribbean to the Mediterranean, or it goes to the Spanish coast.
It's got to be Atlantis.
Yeah. I was also, and I talked to this Art Bell about 10 years ago, and he hadn't heard of it until all of a sudden about 5 years ago it popped up. There's a city underneath the ice in Antarctica.
I heard rumors about that.
They were X-raying the ice. They found it. They started cutting into it with lasers to cut the ice. It's deep down. It's deep down. It's on the continent itself, obviously. But
the whole landmass sank, didn't it?
Yeah.
Jeez, just a matter of time. All right, thanks, Bob. Good. Those are fascinating stories, Hugh.
I mean, regarding Antarctica, this is something that Charles Hapgood and then later Rand Flemeth looked at, and they're convinced that that's actually possibly the site of Atlantis. and it kind of fits in with all the stories of Atlantis being out in the great ocean, past the Pillars of Hercules, etc. And because it's under ice and no one's been able to get through it, well, it sounds like they have now, then perhaps that is where it's at. And you look at the Pires Res map, which, several hundred years old, they actually had the whole of the landmass and the coast mapped on that. And so it must have been free of ice, the last few thousand years. And actually it was known about in prehistory before, as these maps were being made. So, yeah, I'd be very interested in any developments on that.
Well, it was probably pretty tropical a long time ago.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and also the ones off Florida as well fascinate me, because that's one of the major grid points as well on the planet. So I'd be very interested in any more research on that, because again, that's another case for Atlantis there, which is definitely worth looking at. And I'd love to see these photos the Navy took for sure.
Let's go to Grants, New Mexico, west of the Rockies. It's James' turn on Coast to Coast. Hey, James.
Hey, George. First-time caller, long-time listener.
Thank you.
I'm a pilot, and I wondered if your guest had any information on the lines that are visible in New Mexico from the air. These lines are carved into the surface of the Earth, obviously long before today's present geology. If you fly these lines, they break up where canyons and mountains now are, but they continue on when you fly beyond them. And they're visible because they're filled with vegetation because they were carved into the surface at some time. And I've never been able to find any information about it. In fact, the only people I ever have talked to are other pilots that have noticed them, and I've never heard anybody else mention it.
Huh, I have not. And how about you, Hugh?
Whereabouts in New Mexico do you mean exactly?
Well, they're visible in various parts of the state. The first ones I noticed were in the eastern half of the state, over by White Sands. Now, understand that the geology here is very dry. It's high desert, so there's not a lot of vegetation. So when something is carved in, it fills with vegetation, and that's what makes the lines noticeable. And they're true north-oriented, north to south, and they're evenly spaced approximately a mile apart from each other. But they run forever. I mean, you can follow them. They disappear where there's canyons and mountains that obviously occurred after these lines were put in, so they're very ancient. And someone did it. Some intelligence put them there, and I have no idea for what, or never been able to find anything about them.
A roadmap to something.
It's fascinating because I know Chaco Canyon. When you go, spokes of lines come out from there.
Yeah, that's one of the areas.
So whether that's connected or not is very interesting. And also, obviously, there's the whole Nazca thing in South America.
In Peru.
But yeah, I've heard about this before. There's a guy called Paul Devereaux who's done some research on what he calls spirit roads or spirit paths. And he's done some research on New Mexico. I haven't got the information in front of me right now, but I believe he's probably got some research on some of the stuff you're talking about. And if you could forward any stuff to me or to George, that'd be great to have a look at it, and we can maybe analyze it and let you know what we think about it.
Absolutely. Next up, we go to Michael in Norfolk, Virginia. Hey, Michael, go ahead.
Hi. When you had Zahi Hawass on the last time was late November of 2008.
No, I had him even later than that, believe it or not.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
You did?
I had him sometime last year.
Oh, I missed that show, and I very seldom miss a show. Well, since we have Mr. Newman here with us, George, you have been steadily moving Egyptology forward, but most of it has been done in secrecy because it has had to be done in secrecy. In other words, you're bringing on guests, They're bringing out little pieces. People like Glenn Kimball knows he can only say so much. So what he says
the late, by the way, he just passed away.
Yeah, the late Glenn Kimball. So he would say to you right after Zahi was here on the show, he would say to you, well, you know, I'd kick over a little bit of dust and there'd be pottery there, and I'd kick over a little more and there'd be pottery. Well, these little clues are what has to be done for the very reason, and Mr. Newman, I want to get your response to this, for the very reason that Zahi Hawass told you when you asked him, is there interest in archaeology, the pyramids and all this, inside Egypt? He said no.
He said no.
He said he can't get people enthusiastic about this. Now, this is a part of the mystery. This is why people who come there and who want to continue visiting in Egypt have to talk in circles, talk in clues, but it's going to end tonight. The white powder that Carmen Bolter talked about, seeing in the pyramid, has been talked about since Napoleon talked about it and before that, when he visited there. Now, when Rob Simone had a guest talking about the pyramid in Bosnia, he talked about a mysterious white powder. If you go to the Mayan pyramids, you will see traces of a mysterious white powder.
The late Lawrence Gardner talked about that.
Exactly. We have analyzed that powder. Carmen Bolter believed that it was otherworldly, that it was out of this world. But why should a mystery remain a mystery all these centuries when it's there? Anybody can pick it up, scoop it up, put it in their pocket, take it out, and get it analyzed. Why should that happen? And why should people keep talking about it as a mystery when all they have to do is do that? I'll tell you why. We've analyzed it. We know what it is. It's in Illinois. It's in Iowa. It's in the grain silos. It's grain dust. We know what it is. The mystery is solved.
Well, there you go.
Okay. I mean, there is a connection there. I mean, some of the analysis which George just mentioned is that in some places, in some of these pyramid sites and temples, they found this white powdered gold, which is the monatomic elements.
Right.
Cerebit al-Qadim in the Sinai in Egypt. I visited there myself recently and had a good look at the Hathor temple there. And apparently that's where they used to make this white powder gold. And they found loads of this white powder back in the 1920s when William Flinders Petrie was there, who was one of the sort of key Egypt archaeologists, one of the pioneers. And so, yeah, I mean, I get the sense that there's something to do with grains as well, like you say, that placing grains at these sites charges them up. And I think the pyramids were partly one of the reasons they were designed for that. And you mentioned Bosnia as well and the pyramids there. I mean, that's a whole other world of research. And Semir Samos-Managic, who made all the discoveries there, has got all the first-hand research, and it's really worth, getting in touch with him about that. He's actually coming over to England to Megalithomania in the middle of May this year, and please join us because we're actually doing a tour over there with him in early September. So, Megalithomania tour. So it'd be great to have people like yourself who are fascinated by these sites joining us because sort of to question Semir and question the archaeologists. And there's a lot of people, international consortium coming to Bosnia at that time, having a conference there, which we can discuss these aspects and, in different parts of the world. So I really appreciate what you said.
Tell us about this megalithic picture you sent us. This huge...
the one in Britain?
Yeah, the one in Brittany.
That is fascinating. That I can't remember exactly where that is because there's so many in Brittany.
It's huge.
Incredible. It's huge. Tell me about it. I mean, that was one of. It blew me away. I mean, I'm not tiny or anything. That is actually that big.
Is that Is that little OU standing next to it?
A little bit there, yeah. And yeah, the more if you go to Brittany, I mean, like, everything is about twice the size there as it is anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the deeper mysteries that some of the stones there are like several hundred tons.
and they just sort of, as though the ancient people were playing with them. I mean, and there's a guy called Howard Crowhurst who's done some brilliant research on Brittany. He's coming to Megalithomania in May this year as well, and I really recommend people find out about his research or tune in to Megalithomania when we have it online, live streaming and stuff like that, because he really has cracked the whole Brittany code, all the archaeoastronomy, all the lays and the grids. And he believes there was a specific grid system they were using there. And also, if people want to join, we're going to be going there as a group. Anyone can join us. Megalithomania tour to Brittany around the time of the summer solstice in mid to late June. But we're going to explore these mysteries with Howard and hopefully with Robin Heath and a few others. So it really is about, this is where I'm at. I really want to get out to these sites, explore them, study them, feel the energies there. I think it's a really important aspect of that, and I think Brittany is one of the keys to this whole mystery.
The Easter Island structure, Moy, is it? It's huge. Yeah. Huge.
Yeah.
How did it get there?
I mean, there's stuff on Easter Island. I haven't been there yet myself, but I've looked at some of the photographs there. Not only have you got the fascinating heads that all face east, you've also got these polygonal megalithic walls, which are just like the ones you get in Peru, which are just like the ones you get in Egypt. And you even get similar ones like that in Italy and Greece and other places.
It is amazing. Hugh, let's talk a little bit more about that and then wrap things up with some final calls. Well, our next Coast to Coast program, a little bit of ghosts and a lot of open lines. It'll be a full moon night and anything goes. We'll be back in a moment with final calls with Hugh Newman on Coast to Coast AM. Hugh, is there any specific region around this planet that might have a little bit more energy, stronger grids than other areas?
I think the classic answer to that is probably Giza. I must admit that I went to Egypt twice over the last 6 months. I got back just in the nick of time recently in January, so that was interesting. But yeah, I find that particular area very fascinating and very powerful. And you hear so much about it, and you really have to go there. And I went to virtually all the sites I could in Egypt, including sites in the Sinai and really far south, etc. But there's something about the Giza Plateau and the energy there that really gets me. Other sites around the world that really fascinate me, in Guatemala, there's a place called Tikal, which is a very famous tourist site. I've been there twice as well now, and I had such a profound experience. The first time I went there, I couldn't leave, and I stayed there for a week and set up a hammock and just didn't leave because I was so blown away by the energy there. I found that particularly powerful. And so there are a lot of power sites. I think a lot of people resonate with them for different reasons. And I think a lot of it is to do with either our ancestors or past lives and our connections with the sites on that level. I found that very strongly at Tikal in Guatemala especially. I actually met several people there when I was there in 2003, and we all knew we'd been there 1,000 years before. Do you know what I mean? All four of us, and we're like, oh my goodness. And so, yeah, it depends on where you're at, and and if you spend time and tune into the places. I think that's a very important side of it.
These lines that are there, were they? We talked about the ancients. Had some incredible knowledge about this. How did it get to be so planet-wide known?
That's a good question. This is one of the sort of academic kind of struggles that's been going on for several decades. There's alternative thinkers who believe there's diffusionism, where people would sail around the world in boats, they would travel, and they would explore, and they would map the planet. And there's evidence of this when you look at the legends in like Mexico, for instance, of Quetzalcoatl. In South America, Peru, Bolivia area with Viracocha. In Ireland with the Tuatha De Danann, Osiris stories in Egypt. And you find that they're all very similar stories, and they're lost in antiquity of when they were, but that people were turning up, obviously from a different culture, because they were described as being pale-skinned with beards, etc., speaking different languages and things like this. And they would teach the arts of civilization and culture and megalithic construction and agriculture and all these higher qualities. And so it suggests that there was diffusionism. They were traveling around the world, spreading high knowledge, possibly surveying the planet at the same time, building and teaching the locals about megalithic sites, things like this. Whereas the other side of the coin is that, that there was no travel over the seas at all. And people would walk around the planet, which would be quite insane, really, when you think how easy it is to get in a boat and travel across the Atlantic. Something that Thor Heyerdahl, did quite effectively in many different expeditions, quite famous ones, through the Pacific and through the Atlantic. So I think diffusionism and using boats and ships even was the mode of transport, unless, of course, you get into the Vimana aircraft sort of studies as well.
That tells you that we did have high technology.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so. Yeah, it makes sense. I think the human mind and the human capabilities are pretty much been, the same. They've sort of ebbed and flowed over different epochs, the Golden Age, the sort of more darker ages. But I think the human mind is so inquisitive and got so much time and materials everywhere. We would just get into stuff. We would be building stuff, experimenting, traveling around the world. We want to explore, go on off places. We just want to do that. It's the nature of the human. It's only today that we're kind of bogged down with 9-to-5 jobs and debts and stress that, and all the world's kind of been mapped, that it's not so much like that anymore. Whereas I think in ancient times, when there's less people, less of what we have today, I think it would have been much more like that, yeah.
All right, to the phones we go. Mark is in Sacramento. Hey, Mark, go ahead.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good.
Great show, very interesting. I had a question concerning the ley lines and the energy that they give off. I know how this is a electromagnetic universe and how we're like electromagnetic beings, and I was wondering, because lately I've been hearing a lot of talk about how there's going to be a consciousness shift in 2012 and how the vibrations is going to change. And I was just wondering, because something strange is happening to me. I know that when I close my eyes, I can feel my I know my body's not moving, but I can feel my like I was telling you before, I can feel my consciousness rotating. And I was just kind of wondering, what do other people see when they close their eyes, like at night, if they meditate or anything? I looked on the internet and I saw that a lot of people see all these spinning lights and, little things that look like the universe spinning left and right. And I was just wondering, would that have anything to do with the upcoming storm in 2012?
That's a good question.
Many different things there. Well, first of all, if you're by a ley line, does anything happen to you?
It's quite plausible. It's possible. If there's like two of them crossing, sometimes you can get an energy kind of vortex, and this can be have quite a strong effect. Or even if you're just on one line that's going through your house, that can also have either a positive or negative effect. Depends what else is happening on that ley line, because things could be happening miles away on the same line, and that energy signature could be traveling along it, and you could pick it up. And so there's these things to consider. Another aspect is the geopathic stress, which is something that geomancers and dowsers are experts at. And where there's certain types of grids or lines that cross, it can have a very negative effect. And it can actually stress the body out and put the brain into a strange state. But also there's positive things. Well, it really depends. It's the way that towns and villages and cities are constructed in modern times actually cause a lot of stress with the energies in the landscape, whereas the ancients, whether it's Feng Shui in China or whether it's Western geomancy in Europe, they worked with the landscape and they understood and felt the energies, and this is something that's very sort of fundamental within us. And I believe, as I was saying earlier, the effects it has in our brain and the visions we may see when we close our eyes could be to do with being on a PowerPoint, and there could be charged energy there. So there's a number of different things that could cause an effect. But yes, there certainly are different effects that have been noted.
There you go, Mark. Let's go next to Holiday, Florida. John's turn. John, good morning.
Hello. Thanks for having me on, George.
Sure
Hello. I have a question for Hugh based on archaeological research that I've been doing. I found 2,000 stone anchors along the west coast of Florida and the pieces of the anchors as well. And as you map this out on the west coast of Florida, you can see that there's a 10 degrees north of east line coming off of the coast going eastward. And it appears that there was a giant fleet of ships on the west coast of Florida, size of oil tankers, and they were maybe pushed in a gigantic surf and broken apart. And in any scientific experiment, you have to be able to repeat it. And so we've seen the repeating of this 10 degrees north of east angle of these stones coming up onto the shore. And it's a big indicator that giant tsunami must have hit Florida in ancient times and thrown these giant stone anchors onto land. So I have a theory that there's two kinds of megalithic structures: the structures that man has put on the earth himself, and then the megalithic structures that have been put on the earth by accident, such as stone circles that are all over the world, which would indicate that giant ships had survived the flood and let down at certain points around the world, leaving their stones in a semicircle or a circle, and then dismantling their ships. And, thus we would have indigenous plants, animals, and people all over the world. What does Hugh think about that?
There you go, Hugh.
Well, that's actually fascinating, actually. I'm very interested in what you said. I mean, it does make a lot of sense because there's a lot of sites that look like they're man-made and possibly aren't. I mean, one of the big debates is the Yonaguni underwater structures, pyramids off the coast of an island of Japan, whereas it looks like it's natural, but it's a debate whether it's man-made or not. But and you mentioned stone circles or semicircles. Can you just explain what you mean? How would that occur from a ship?
Yeah, I can. On the back of the ships in ancient times, they used to have 10 or 12 of these stones hanging around as anchors and ballast on the outsides of the ship.
Right. And they're pretty big size, weren't they?
And you can actually see this on YouTube under Johann von Sachs is my name on YouTube. And you can see how these stones have actually just been placed there after a flood rather than placed there by men moving around. As opposed to Stonehenge, these are more or less naturally placed there after a catastrophe. And it would indicate that Tarpon Springs would be the ancient Garden of Eden because it's on the west coast of Florida, halfway up and down the coast. And the Anclote River would be the Arcadian River of Greek mythology, and the Garden of Hesperides would be Tarpon Springs, Florida, because it has the underground river Alpheus and the overground river, the Arcadian River here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, this anchor thing, actually, because I remember Graham Hancock in his underworld research, his sunken civilizations of the Ice Age, there were some what looked like underwater stone circles or semicircles, and so perhaps you could be onto something there, but I don't know how that would explain the 900 stone circles in Britain, some that are high up on hills, but certainly I think for some of them it does make a lot of sense. And I'm very interested in these anchors you've discovered. I mean, I'd love to see some photos of them and also where they are. I mean,
you can. He said you can see it on YouTube under Johann Sachs.
Oh, okay.
Sachs.
Yeah, I definitely have to have a look at that because that's absolutely fascinating. Okay. Yeah,
you know what's probably so fascinating, Hugh? What is on the bottom of the sea?
Yes.
My gosh, if we could just for one day drain all the oceans and look at all that stuff that's down there. Can you imagine what would be there? Sunken cities, ships, who knows what, planes.
Yeah.
My God.
Absolutely. I mean, I believe in Britain is a good example of that. I mean, because England used to be joined with France and other parts of Northern Europe. And so there's a whole channel there, potential. And we know that Brittany and southern Britain, there's megalithic sites strongly in both parts. There's probably amazing amount of stuff that is yet to be discovered. And I wonder if any of it's sort of anything's being preserved down there, which could give some clues as to unlocking the mysteries of these ancient civilizations.
Do we know if the planet has calamity, whether you name it, war, famine, if the crop formations show up more?
So what do you mean by that exactly?
I mean, do we have more crop formations during times of strife on this planet?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that, actually. That's, if any crop circle researchers are listening.
Yeah, I'm just wondering when one pops up like the one we just had in Indonesia.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what's been happening. So maybe it's like a warning. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it could be connected. It's like what Richard mentioned with what's happening in Egypt, and the energy of what people are feeling and thinking, and what's being spread around the internet, and reactions to things is actually going through the grid. It's going through the earth energies and the ley lines, and actually it manifests actually in crop circles and things like that. It wouldn't surprise me if that was part of the way the crop circles are actually created. Is actually our own passionate energies and thoughts and feelings. So I would imagine there's something in that, George. Yeah.
Well, let's go to Randall in Columbia, Mississippi, first-time caller. Hi, Randall.
Yes, sir. How y'all doing tonight?
We are fine. Thanks.
Good.
I noticed there's been a lot of discussion and studies on Egypt and South America, but does your guest know of any studies that's been done on any of the ruins that were reported by soldiers during the Vietnam War? They said that they've seen ancient ruins, huge temples and stuff in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. I was wondering if there was any studies that had been done on them.
I don't know of any. Hugh?
No, I'm not aware of any either, but I know there would be Buddhist temples down that way for sure. But I'd be very interested. I'd be very interested in looking into that, actually.
Hugh's book, of course, is called Earth Grids. That cruise we were talking about, the Mayan cruise, if you're interested, with Jim Mars is going to be on it, Daniel Brinkley, Richard Hoagland, they'll all be there. 1-866-348-4658. 866-348-4658. Richard says there's still some tickets available. It's a 7-day cruise, if you're interested in that. That's a pretty long time. Hugh, they're going to try to see if they can get you on it. So get ready for that. Let's go to John in Ontario, Canada. Get you in here real fast, John. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks for taking the call. You spoke about the grid lines, and giving off energy. Now, you mentioned briefly that they do give off negative energy too. And on the internet, when you Google geopathic stress, they say if you're on a Hartman or a Curry line or even a Benker cube, they deplete your immune system, and I think this is a cause of...
Interesting. So opposite effect then, huh?
That's certainly the case, yeah, absolutely.
So I would think it would enhance your energy, Hugh.
It can do. It really depends, because it's like the whole thing with energy. It can work both ways. And if like I mentioned earlier, if the landscape or the way the building has been constructed isn't in accordance with geomancy and the landscape and the natural energies, which is what geomancers and feng shui experts that's what they do, then often you can get stress points building up. And like you mentioned, the Hartman and Curry grids is something that fascinates me, because these are very tight grids that cover the whole planet, and they kind of interact with each other, and often where they cross on the stronger lines of these grids, this is where problems can occur. And it's actually been proven over and over again that these are related to debilitating diseases if your bed is positioned in the wrong place, and it's actually on one of these crossing points. So it's worth checking that out, either getting a geomancer in to have a look at your place. They can do it remotely as well, things like this, or just testing it out with dowsing for yourself. But often, you can just intuitively tune in and work out where is the best place to place your bed. I mean, and things like this. So there's two sides to the coin. Often you could be sleeping somewhere that charges you up and it feels really good, and often it can be the opposite. So it's definitely worth getting that checked out, considering the way that houses and developments, towns are now constructed.
Absolutely. Hugh, enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, George. It's been a pleasure.
Hugh Newman, his book, again, Earth Grids. Fascinating, isn't it? How they're all over the place. And I'm convinced Edward Leeds Scullin built his coral castle on these ley lines, and it helped him move those blocks of stone.